The marriage broker smiled as he counted the money. $1,200, cash, folded neatly into his inside pocket while Naomi Ashcroft stood 3 feet away, reading the contract he'd handed her with shaking hands. A contract that described her as experienced frontier homesteader, age 28, widowed, hardy constitution, accustomed to rural life. She was 18 years old. She had never left Philadelphia. She had never cooked over an open fire, never saddled a horse, never spent a single night without a roof over her head. He knew every word of it was a lie. He pocketed the money anyway. "Sign it," her uncle said from the doorway, not looking at her. "Or find somewhere else to sleep by Friday." If this story already has your heart pounding, hit that like button right now, drop your city and country in the comments so I can see exactly how far this story has traveled, and subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter. Stories like this one don't come around often. Let's begin. The train platform at Harwick Junction, Montana, smelled like coal smoke and horse manure and something else. Naomi couldn't name, something cold and mineral and indifferent that seemed to rise directly from the frozen ground beneath her feet. She stood with her trunk at her side, her carpet bag gripped in both hands, wearing the nicest dress she owned, which was not very nice at all. The hem was already dark with slush. Her boots, purchased secondhand from a market stall on Chestnut Street, had begun leaking somewhere around the Wyoming border. She was the last passenger off the train. She had waited deliberately, watching through the grimy window as the other passengers disembarked into the arms of waiting relatives or strode off with the particular confidence of people who knew exactly where they were going. She had waited until the platform thinned out, hoping the walk from the car to solid ground might feel less like walking onto a stage. It didn't work. The moment her boot touched the platform boards, she heard it. Not a single voice, a ripple of reaction that passed through the small crowd like wind across water. Whispers. Then a laugh, quickly smothered. Then another that wasn't smothered at all. A man in a sheepskin coat leaned toward the woman beside him and said something behind his gloved hand. The woman's eyes moved over Naomi from boots to hat brim, and her expression did the thing faces did. That particular collapse of politeness into something more honest and less kind. Naomi had spent 18 years learning to walk through that expression. She lifted her chin and kept moving. The station agent, a narrow man with a patchy beard and ink-stained fingers, looked up from his window when she approached. "Naomi Ashcroft," she said. "I'm expected. By a Mr. Silas Mercer." The station agent stared at her for a moment too long. "Mercer," he repeated, as though the name required careful consideration. "Yeah," he telegraphed ahead. He looked past her as though confirming she had actually arrived alone. This is you." "Yes," Naomi said. "This is me." The agent scratched the back of his neck. He looked genuinely uncomfortable, which she appreciated more than she would have appreciated pity. "He ain't here yet. Said to tell whoever arrived to wait inside the depot. Said he'd be in before dark." "Thank you," Naomi said. She dragged her trunk across the platform herself, because there was no one offering to help, and maneuvered it through the depot door. Inside it was warmer by perhaps 10 degrees, thus not warm, but no longer punishing. A cast-iron stove in the corner burned low. 3 wooden benches faced each other across a plank floor worn smooth by decades of boots. 2 men sat on the bench nearest the stove, playing cards. They looked up when she came in. One of them said something she couldn't quite catch, and both of them laughed. Naomi sat on the bench farthest from the stove and folded her hands in her lap and stared at the wall. Outside, through the single depot window, she could see the town of Harwick Junction in the failing afternoon light. It was smaller than she'd imagined and meaner looking. A main street with maybe 15 storefronts, half of them with their shutters still closed against the January cold. A water trough frozen solid at the near end of the street. A church at the far end with half its steeple missing, patched with what appeared to be raw timber. She tried to remember what the marriage broker, a man named Clement Hod, had told her about the arrangement. He described it in the careful, layered way of a man who'd had practice building rooms out of words that didn't quite connect to any real floor or ceiling. He told her Silas Mercer was a man of considerable frontier experience and substantial property. He told her the Montana Territory was raw but rewarding for those of determined character. He told her the match was mutually beneficial in a tone that made her understand she was not to ask what she was bringing to the mutuality. What she'd understood, even at 18, was simpler than any of his language. Her family wanted her gone. Her aunt and uncle had taken her in after her parents died of fever when she was 11, and they had fed her and clothed her and made clear every single year of those 7 years that they considered these acts of basic human decency to be a sacrifice of significant personal cost. Her cousins had treated her the way children often treat the household's charity case, sometimes ignoring her, sometimes worse. When Clement Hod appeared at the house last November, hat in hand, with a contract and a train ticket, and what he called an opportunity, her uncle had called her downstairs and placed the papers in front of her at the kitchen table and said, "Sign it, or find somewhere else to sleep by Friday." She had signed it. She had told herself it was her own choice, which was almost true. She had told herself Montana might be better, which she hadn't really believed but had needed to say in some interior part of herself in order to get through the following weeks. Now she was sitting on a bench in a frozen depot in a town that looked like it had been built by people who'd stopped caring halfway through, and the men across the room were still laughing at something, and she didn't know if Silas Mercer was a decent man or a cruel one, or simply old and weathered and resigned. And outside the wind had begun to move through the gap under the depot door in a way that seemed almost intentional. She folded her hands tighter and waited. He came in just before dark. She heard him before she saw him. Boots on the platform boards, heavier and more deliberate than average. The particular sound of someone who didn't hurry, but also didn't drift. The depot's door opened, and cold air moved through the room like a physical thing, and then the door closed again. Silas Mercer was not what she'd built in her imagination. She'd constructed a version of him from the handful of facts in the broker's letter. Experienced trapper, mountain property, no family living. And her imagination had produced something vague and bear-like and possibly toothless. The man standing in the doorway knocking snow off his boots was perhaps 50, with the kind of face that had clearly been handsome once and had weathered into something sharper and more severe. He was tall. Not theatrical tall, just tall in the way of men who spent their lives outdoors and never thought about it. His coat was beaver fur and looked genuinely old, repaired in multiple places with what appeared to be rawhide. His hat was pushed back enough to see his eyes when he looked around the room. Those eyes stopped on her. She watched him process what he was seeing. She had learned over years of practice to read that particular moment, the half second when a new face encountered her and recalibrated. Sometimes the recalibration resulted in polite withdrawal. Sometimes it resulted in the kind of too loud friendliness that was worse than indifference. Occasionally, rarely, the face just settled and stayed. Silas Mercer's face settled and stayed. He crossed the room and stopped a few feet away. Naomi Ashcroft. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Not awkward quiet, thinking quiet. She noticed his eyes weren't staying on her body, weren't doing the inventory she'd braced herself for. He was looking at her face, and whatever he was working it out behind his eyes where she couldn't see it. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I'd appreciate a straight answer." "All right." The broker's paperwork described you as an experienced frontier woman, widowed, 28 years old, accustomed to outdoor life and homestead work. Naomi said nothing. "Are any of those things true?" he asked. She considered the question. "I'm accustomed to hard work," she said. "I don't know anything about frontier life. I'm 18. I've never been married." Something moved across his face. Not anger. Something more complicated. He turned away from her briefly, and she could see the muscles in his jaw working. When he turned back, his voice was controlled, but she could hear the effort it cost. "Hod," he said. Not a question. Just the name, released like something being set down hard on a table. "He took money from my family," Naomi said. "I assume he told you something different about me than what he told me about you." "What did he tell you about me?" "That you were a man of substantial property and frontier experience. That the match was mutually beneficial." She paused. "He didn't mention the part where you were expecting someone else entirely." Silas rubbed the back of his neck. The two card-playing men were quiet now, very obviously listening. Silas glanced at them, and they both found something urgently interesting in their cards. "The situation," Silas said, keeping his voice low, "is that I have a cabin 2 days up into the Beartooth Range. I came down for a bride because a man alone up there makes more mistakes than a man with a partner. I need someone who can manage a homestead, not someone to—" He stopped himself, started again. I need a working partner, not a dependent. I understand, Naomi said. I'm not sure you do, he said, not unkindly. It's January. There's 3 to 4 feet of snow between here and my property. The trail is not a trail this time of year. What I'm describing is not... Again, he stopped. It's not a comfortable life, even in summer. Right now, it's something else. I understand that too. Do you? She looked at him steadily. She was scared, had been scared since the train crossed the Wyoming border, had been scared since she signed the papers, had been scared in some low continuous frequency for most of her 18 years. But she had learned that fear and function were not incompatible. You could be afraid and still keep your hands on the thing in front of you. I'm not going to pretend I know what I'm walking into, she said. I'd be lying, and you've already had enough lies today. What I can tell you is that I'm not soft in the ways you're probably thinking. I'm not delicate. I've never had the luxury of being delicate. She paused. If you leave me here, I don't have anywhere to go. I spent my last $6 on the train ticket because Hod told me the arrangements were in order. If you leave me here, I'll figure something out, because that's what I always do. But I'd rather not start from nothing in a town I don't know in January. Silas was quiet for long enough that one of the card-playing men shifted on his bench. Can you walk? Silas said. Yes. I mean real walking. All day walking, in snow, with weight on your back. I don't know, she said. I've never done it. But I've worked 12-hour days in a laundry, and I've hauled coal up 4 flights of stairs, and I once carried a woman's fainting couch up 3 flights because she tipped 20 cents, so I'd say I have a reasonable understanding of what my body can do. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not yet, but something moved that had been very still. All right, he said. He looked toward the window where the sky was doing its final descent toward dark. We'll stay in town tonight. There's a boarding house on the south end of the main street that's decent enough. Tomorrow morning we move. Together? She said. I'm not leaving you here. The boarding house was called Reardon's, and it was run by a woman named Dolores Reardon, who was perhaps 60, gray-haired, and had the energy of someone who'd long since stopped tolerating nonsense. She looked Naomi up and down when they came through the door, and then she looked at Silas, and something in her assessment settled. 2 rooms, Silas said. I've got 1.5, Dolores said. There's a proper room and there's what I call the alcove, which is a room in the sense that it has 4 walls and a ceiling, but it's got no window, and the ceiling slopes. She looked at Naomi again. You're the mail order? I am, Naomi said. Dolores made a sound that was neither approval nor disapproval, but something more primary than either, pure information gathering. Mercer, she said, looking at Silas, you know what you got yourself into? The broker lied to both of us, Silas said. They always do. She pulled a key from behind the counter. Young lady gets the proper room. You get the alcove. Dinner's at 7. You miss it. You go hungry. She handed Naomi the key. Stairs are to your left. Bathroom at the end of the hall. You share it with whoever else is in the house, which tonight is one traveling salesman who minds his business and snores. Hot water runs for about 10 minutes, and then it's cold. Thank you, Naomi said. Dolores looked at her for a moment longer, that particular look of someone who is taking a genuine measurement of a person they don't expect to see again and wants to make it count. You look scared, she said. That's the smartest thing I've seen walk through my door this week. Dinner at Reardon's was salt pork, fried potatoes, canned peaches from a jar that had probably been put up the previous summer, and black coffee that tasted like something that had been apologizing for itself for a long time. The traveling salesman was a small, cheerful man named Pullman, who sold patent medicines and had perfected the art of making conversation that required no reciprocation. He talked about his route from Helena to Billings and back, about the weather, about a family he'd passed on the road north, who'd been moving freight on a sled pulled by oxen, and Naomi ate her fried potatoes and was grateful for the noise. Silas ate in the particular focused silence of a man eating a meal he hadn't cooked himself and was determined to finish. Once, over the course of the meal, their eyes met across the table. It lasted half a second. She looked away first. After dinner, she went upstairs, sat on the narrow bed in her proper room, and took stock. She had a carpet bag with 2 changes of clothing, a wool coat that was adequate for Philadelphia winters, and was going to be genuinely insufficient for whatever tomorrow would ask of it, a pair of boots that leaked, a small amount of money that was, she had confirmed, not quite sufficient for a train ticket back to anywhere, and a situation that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the one she'd been promised. She sat with all of this for a while. Then she opened her carpet bag and took out the small packet of letters she'd brought with her. There were 3 of them, written in a hand she didn't recognize, letters that had supposedly been exchanged between herself and Silas Mercer, their courtship correspondence, all of it fabricated by Clement Hod and signed with her name without her knowledge. She'd found them tucked into the folder of documents when she was packing and had read them on the train with growing nausea. The woman in those letters was confident and experienced and 30 years ahead of Naomi in every sense. She described her years on her late husband's homestead in western Pennsylvania. She described her skill with a rifle, her knowledge of medicinal plants, her ability to tan hides. She was, in those letters, practically a legend. Naomi folded the letters carefully and set them on the bed beside her. Then she thought about what Silas Mercer had said. "I'm not leaving you here." She tried to decide if that was good news. She decided it was provisionally good news. She got into bed with her wool coat on because the room was cold, and she lay in the dark, and she listened to the wind outside begin to build against the wall of the boarding house, and she thought about the way Silas's eyes had settled on her face in the depot and hadn't moved. She had expected many things from this arrangement. She had not expected to be looked at like she was a person whose answer mattered. She slept, eventually. Not well. Silas knocked on her door at 5 in the morning. He didn't say good morning, just, "We need to move. Weather's coming." She was already dressed. He had a pack mule in the livery stable, a large gray animal named, she would learn, Barnabas, who had the patient expression of a creature that had seen considerable foolishness and found it neither surprising nor particularly interesting. He also had, for reasons she didn't immediately understand, a second set of snowshoes that he handed to her without explanation in the livery stable doorway. "You ever worn these?" he said. "No." He crouched down in the dirty stable straw and showed her with economical and impersonal hands how to strap them on. "You walk wider than you normally would. It feels stupid. You'll get used to it." "How long until we get there?" 2 days if the weather holds, 3 if it doesn't." "And will it hold?" He looked at the sky through the stable's open top door, where the gray of pre-dawn was doing something she couldn't interpret. "No," he said. They left Harwick Junction as the sun was coming up behind a bank of cloud, so dense and uniform it reduced the morning to a flat, cold light without shadows. The main street was empty except for a dog moving fast along the far boardwalk and a man dumping something off the side steps of the general store who looked up and watched them pass without expression. At the edge of town, where the main street gave way to a road that almost immediately began rising toward the line of dark timber above, a voice called out from behind them. "Mercer!" They stopped. The man who'd called out was heavy-set, wearing a good coat that was too clean for the kind of cold he was standing in, the kind of coat that lived mostly indoors. He was maybe 45, with a full reddish beard going gray at the edges and the ruddy, permanent flush of a man who drank seriously. "Fletcher," Silas said. "Not warm, not hostile. Measured." Fletcher's eyes moved to Naomi with the particular slowness of a man who wanted to make sure you knew he was looking. He took his time. When his gaze came back to Silas, he was already smiling. "So this is the Philadelphia mail order." He said it the way people say things when they want you to know it isn't a compliment. "Hod must have had some nerve sending this up the mountain." Silas said nothing. "I'm just saying," Fletcher said, spreading his hands in a gesture of theatrical reasonableness. "A man your age, alone up in the Beartooth for another winter. It might have been better to cut your losses down here than to drag that poor girl up into the snow to freeze." He looked at Naomi again. "No offense, sweetheart. I'm sure you're a fine person, in whatever city you came from." Naomi had heard variations of this her entire life. The particular structure of the insult, the false sympathy for her, the implied incompetence, the suggestion that her existence was itself some sort of problem to be managed. She knew this voice the way she knew the weight of her own body on her feet. "None taken," she said. "Don't," Silas said to Fletcher, and his voice had changed. It was still quiet, but it had acquired an edge that hadn't been there before. Fletcher put his hands up again, still smiling. "Just being neighborly. You know the offer stands, Mercer. Your land, fair price, enough for you to spend whatever winters you've got left somewhere that isn't trying to kill you." "I know the offer," Silas said. "I've given you my answer." "Offers change." Fletcher looked at Naomi one more time, a final, deliberate assessment, and then he nodded to Silas and turned back toward the town. His boots crunched in the snow, unhurried, the walk of a man who considered himself to have made his point. Naomi watched him go. "What was that?" "A problem," Silas said. "Not today's problem." He started walking again, leading Barnabas by the halter. "Today's problem is the weather." The timber closed around them within the first hour. The trail Silas was following was not obvious. It was a set of markers, notches cut into specific trees at shoulder height, a pattern of broken branches, once a stack of 3 flat stones on a rock outcropping, that Silas read with the fluency of someone who'd been reading this particular language for decades. Without him, she would have been lost in minutes. She kept her eyes on his back, and she kept moving. The snowshoes were as awkward as he'd warned. Her hips began to ache from the widened stride within the first hour, and by the second hour the ache had moved into her lower back. And by the third hour she understood, in a physical and practical sense, what he'd meant about the difference between hard work and this. It wasn't that she couldn't manage it. She found with some surprise that she could manage it, but it was demanding the kind of attention that left no room for anything else, which was, in its way, a relief. Silas stopped twice in the morning, once to check what appeared to be a set of animal tracks crossing the trail. He crouched, looked at them for a long moment, said nothing, and moved on. And once to adjust something in Barnabas's load that had shifted. He didn't talk much. When he did speak, it was direct and functional. "Stay to the left of that outcropping. The snow's unstable on the right. When we come down off this ridge, it'll be colder, wind from the north. Keep your hands moving. If your fingers stop feeling warm, tell me." She told him around noon that her left foot had been wet for about 2 hours because of the boot. He stopped walking. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Then he sat her down on a fallen log, unlaced the boot himself, looked at it, and said, "Why didn't you say something earlier?" "I thought I could manage." "You can manage until you can't," he said. He had a spare pair of wool socks in his pack. She would learn this was one of several spare pairs he carried, a habit of a man who had learned precisely which failures were fatal. He wrung the wet sock out against the log, stuffed it inside his coat against his body to begin drying it, and pulled a dry pair over her foot before relacing the boot. "We'll stop at the halfway shelter tonight. Get that boot closer to the fire." "Is there a proper shelter?" 3 walls and a roof, more or less." She almost laughed. "That sounds palatial," he said, deadpan. But she caught something at the corner of his mouth. The afternoon was harder. The sky fulfilled its morning promise and came down lower and grayer, and the wind began moving through the trees with enough purpose to drive snow horizontally in the open stretches between stands of timber. Naomi put her head down and walked. She thought briefly, and with a kind of distant surprise, about the fact that 3 months ago she had been hauling laundry bundles up the back stairs of her uncle's house on a Tuesday afternoon, and the biggest problem she could articulate was whether her cousin Harriet was going to eat the last of the bread before Naomi got to the kitchen. She almost walked into Silas, who had stopped without warning. "Sorry." "Quiet," he said. "I was looking at the tree line to their right." She looked. She couldn't see anything unusual. Snow, timber, the flat gray light. But she held still and quiet because his body had gone into a specific kind of alertness that she recognized, across all differences of background and experience, as the body language of someone who has picked up a signal she had not. A branch fell somewhere in the trees to their right. Just a branch, unloaded by wind. Silas let out a breath. His shoulders came down by about a 1/4 inch. "Elk," he said. "Nervous one." "How did you know it wasn't something else?" "The way it stopped moving after the first sound." He started walking again. "Elk freeze, mountain cats don't." She filed this away. The halfway shelter was as advertised. 3 log walls, a partial fourth, and a roof that was solid, except for one corner that had been repaired with pine boughs, and was clearly being asked to handle more weight than it expected. A ring of fire-blackened stones in the center, ventilation through the open 4th wall. It was not comfortable. It was adequate. In the current context, adequate was quite a lot. Silas built a fire with the focused efficiency of a man for whom fire was not a pleasant amenity, but a serious piece of equipment. He got it going from a small kit of materials in his pack: tinder, charcloth, a flint and steel. And once it caught, he built it up with careful attention before he did anything else. Only after the fire was established and clearly not going anywhere did he begin to deal with the rest, pulling packs off Barnabas, checking the mule's feet and coat, unrolling the bedroll he carried in the largest pack. One bedroll, Naomi noticed. I only brought the one, Silas said without looking up. That was before. He let the sentence find its own end. I'll sleep near the fire. You take the bedroll. That seems like a bad plan for you. I've slept in worse situations. So you say. She looked at the bedroll, then at the fire, then at the corner of the shelter where the repaired roof dripped slightly. She stopped. We could share it, he said, flat, factual. I've done it before with trail partners when the alternative was freezing. It's a practical arrangement. She thought about this. She thought about everything she'd been told, all her life, about what she was and wasn't, and what she deserved and didn't, and what practical arrangements were available to a woman who'd been shipped off to Montana like an inconvenient piece of furniture. She thought about the fact that this man had driven his point into the ground twice, 2 rooms at the boarding house, trail partners, and seemed to have no interest in turning a bad situation into a worse one. All right, she said. They ate cold food from his pack, dried venison, hardtack, dried apples, and drank water he'd melted from snow in a metal cup near the fire. They sat on opposite sides of the fire. The wind outside picked up, and then, around 8 in the evening by Naomi's rough estimate, began to do something different. Not louder, but more constant, a single sustained note instead of gusts. Storm, Silas said. Is that... how bad? Could be a lot worse. We're sheltered enough. He prodded the fire. We'll wait it out in the morning, see what the trail looks like. What if it's impassable? He looked at her across the fire. Then we wait. She thought about her wool coat, which she was currently wearing inside the bedroll with most of her other clothes. She thought about her uncle's house in Philadelphia, which she had walked away from without looking back, which she had told herself she didn't miss, and which she was currently sitting in a 3-sided shelter on a mountain in Montana with a man she'd met yesterday, discovering she did not miss at all. The man at the edge of town, she said. Fletcher. What about him? He mentioned your land. He made an offer. Several. What is it he wants? Silas was quiet for a moment. The fire popped, sending a brief orange spark into the dark. My property sits on the only reliable access route between the South Valley and the high timber on the North Range. If you control it, you control where the logging outfits can move. There's money in that. He paused. Fletcher runs a land consortium out of Billings. They've been buying up routes for 2 years. They want mine. And you won't sell. No. Because it's mine. Simple. Final. Because I built it. Because my partner Nathan Dre and I spent 8 years making that property into something. And Nathan's buried on the ridge above the East Meadow, and I'm not selling it to a suit from Billings so he can run logging traffic over Nathan's grave. The fire burned between them. I'm sorry, Naomi said. About Nathan. Silas looked into the fire. We were up there 12 years, he said. He was a better man than he ever got credit for. He stopped. Go to sleep. Tomorrow's worse than today. She lay down and pulled the bedroll around her, still in her coat. The fire's warmth reached her in waves. Outside, the storm had settled into its own sustained conversation with the trees, a sound that was neither soothing nor alarming but simply present, the sound of weather doing what weather does, indifferent to anything happening beneath it. She thought she would lie awake for hours. She was asleep within minutes. In the gray of early morning, before dawn, she woke because the fire had burned low, and the cold had crossed some threshold that her sleeping body noticed before her conscious mind did. She was pressed against something solid and warm that turned out, when she came fully awake, to be Silas Mercer's back, both of them having migrated unconsciously toward the center of the bedroll and the diminishing warmth of the other. He was still asleep. She lay there for a moment, genuinely unsure what she felt. Not afraid, not offended. Something more complex and less nameable. The strangeness of proximity without intention, the peculiar comfort of a warm back in a freezing shelter in the middle of a mountain blizzard. The awareness that she was not, for the first time in years, the only person in a room who had to manage everything alone. She got up carefully, keeping quiet, and added wood to the fire. She was crouching by the fire when Silas woke. He looked at the rebuilt fire and then at her, and something moved in his face, quick and small, but she caught it. "You didn't have to. It was going out," she said. "Go back to sleep if you need more time. I'll watch it." He sat up instead. His hair was flattened on one side. He rubbed his jaw with the back of his hand and looked out through the open wall of the shelter, where the storm had subsided to something more manageable in the night. Heavy snow still falling, but no longer driven sideways. "We can move in an hour," he said. "Trail will be heavy, but passable." "All right." He looked at her again, that settled, direct look she'd gotten in the depot. "That was good thinking," he said. "The fire." She kept her expression neutral, but something in her chest did a thing she hadn't expected. Not quite pleasure, but something close to its structural cousin. "It was keeping me warm too," she said. He almost smiled. Sure it was. They broke camp in the gray morning, loaded Barnabas again, and moved back into the trail. The snow was up to Naomi's knees in places. She walked. She kept walking. Every step required intention, and intention required her full attention, and she gave it. Somewhere ahead was a cabin on a mountain. Somewhere ahead was a life she hadn't chosen, but also hadn't run from. The mountain didn't care who she'd been. She was beginning, slowly and with considerable effort, to consider the possibility that she didn't care either. The cabin appeared through the timber late on the second afternoon like something that had grown from the mountain rather than been built on it. Naomi had stopped expecting it to look a certain way somewhere around the third hour of the second day's walking, when her capacity for expectation had been largely consumed by the business of keeping her legs moving. So when Silas stopped on a slight rise and said, "There," she looked up and simply saw what was there. A low, solid structure of notched logs. A roof buried under 2 feet of snow with a stovepipe emerging from it trailing a thin line of gray smoke. A lean-to on the east side that housed what appeared to be a woodpile of considerable ambition, and a small outbuilding beyond it, whose purpose she couldn't yet determine. Smoke. He'd left a fire burning. "The stove banks itself," Silas said, reading her look. "I packed it before I left. Should still have coals." She didn't say anything. She just walked the last quarter mile. Inside the cabin was one room, which she'd half expected, but it was larger than the outside suggested, perhaps 20 feet by 16, with a stone fireplace on the north wall and the cast-iron stove opposite. A workbench along the east wall buried under tools and animal pelts in various stages of preparation. A sleeping loft accessible by a ladder along the west wall, and a table with 2 chairs that had clearly been built by someone who cared more about function than form. The chairs didn't match. The table had been leveled with a wedge of wood under one leg. It smelled like wood smoke and pine resin and something animal that wasn't unpleasant, just present. The stove had coals, as promised. Silas fed them wood, and they caught within minutes. The cabin began to warm with the particular fast efficiency of a small enclosed space with a working stove, and Naomi stood near it with her coat still on and let the heat reach her in stages. "Loft's the sleeping area," Silas said, not looking at her working the stove damper. "I'll sleep down here until we—" He stopped, started over. "Until the magistrate can come up from Harwick. There's a judge who does the circuit in late February. We'll send word down with the next supply run." She understood what he was saying without the full sentence. The paperwork Hod had filed was fraudulent. The legal marriage wasn't legal. Nothing that had been arranged was what it claimed to be, and Silas Mercer was, in his particular way, telling her that he understood this and was not going to treat the fraud as a license. "That's fine," she said. "I want to be clear about what I'm offering." He turned to face her. He looked tired. Actually tired, the kind that 2 days in mountain snow produces in even a capable body. But his eyes were direct. "A working arrangement, a real one, properly made. If you decide between now and February that you'd rather go back down to the valley and find another way, I'll put you on the trail myself and make sure you get there safe. No hard feelings. And if I stay, then we figure it out as we go." She looked around the cabin again. The mismatched chairs, the patched tools, the evidence everywhere of a life built in pieces over time. "What did Nathan handle?" she asked. "When he was here." Something passed through Silas's face. "Cooking, mostly. Some of the trapping. He was better with plants than I am, knew which ones to use for what, kept a kitchen garden in summer. The medicinal stores." He nodded toward a shelf on the north wall she hadn't noticed yet, lined with small labeled jars and dried bundles of herbs hanging from a peg rail. Most of that is his work. I've kept it up as best I can, but I don't know half of what I'm looking at. Naomi crossed to the shelf and looked. The labels were written in a small, precise hand: yarrow, valerian, arnica, pine resin, willow bark, dried nettles. Something labeled simply for fever that was a dark, crumbled substance she couldn't identify. Did he teach you anything about them? Some. Not enough. I know a few of these. She touched the yarrow bundle. The woman who ran the laundry where I worked, Mrs. Peel, she was from Kentucky and she used plants for everything. I helped her sometimes when she was preparing things. She paused. I'm not saying I know what I'm doing. I'm saying I know more than nothing. That's more than I've got, Silas said. The first week was an education conducted entirely in the language of physical reality. Naomi had worked hard in Philadelphia, had worked, in fact, almost constantly since she was 11. But the work of the mountain was different in a way she struggled to articulate even to herself. It wasn't harder, exactly, or not only harder. It was more total. Every task existed in relationship to every other task in a chain of consequence that had no slack in it. If you didn't split enough wood today, you would be cold tonight, and being cold tonight meant sleeping poorly, and sleeping poorly meant slower hands tomorrow, and slower hands tomorrow meant a task that should take an hour. Taking 2 and 2 hours lost at this altitude in January was not an abstract inconvenience. She learned this not because Silas lectured her, but because she lived it in her own body, making her own miscalculations and feeling their results. She underestimated the wood her first morning and told herself it was probably enough, and it was not enough. The stove burned low before midnight, and she woke up at 2 in the morning to a cabin that had dropped to something she could see her breath in, and she had to get up and reload the stove herself in the dark, feeling for the woodpile by the door. And she stood there for a long moment in her nightclothes in the February dark, deciding whether she was angry or just humbled, and arriving eventually at humbled because anger didn't generate any heat. She overestimated her ability to read the weather her 4th day, taking Barnabas out to the East Meadow to let him move because Silas had said the mule needed regular exercise, and Silas was out on the trap line. The sky when she left looked manageable. The sky 40 minutes later was doing something else entirely, and she got Barnabas back to the lean-to with some urgency and came inside stamping snow from her boots. And Silas was already back, sitting at the table, saying nothing about the weather change because he didn't need to. I misjudged it, she said. Most people do until they've spent a winter up here. Is there something I should have been looking for? He looked at her. Yes. He got up and took her to the south window and pointed out what he'd been watching, the specific quality of cloud formation on the southwest ridge, the way the wind moved through the upper tree canopy before it moved through the lower, a change in the light that she hadn't had language for, but which he described in terms she could file away and use. He spent maybe 20 minutes explaining it. He didn't make her feel stupid for having missed it. He just explained it like someone passing along information that was useful, which it was. She listened to everything he said this way. He wasn't a natural teacher. He had the habit of experienced solitude, which meant he sometimes assumed she'd arrived at conclusions she hadn't yet reached. But when she asked questions directly, he answered them directly, and his answers were dense with the kind of specific, physical knowledge that no book she'd ever read had come close to capturing. What she learned in those first weeks: how to read the morning sky for afternoon weather, how to load the stove for maximum burn efficiency and not waste wood, how to check and reset the 4 nearest traps on the short line, how to skin and prep a rabbit in 15 minutes, and how to hang the pelt to dry without it going stiff in the wrong shape, how to keep the water barrel from freezing overnight, how to check Barnabas's hooves for ice packing, how to find the weak spots in the cabin's insulation by holding a lit candle near the wall joints and watching the flame. What she also learned, more slowly, and without either of them naming it, that Silas Mercer woke at the same time every morning without any kind of alarm, that he drank his coffee before he spoke to anyone, that he had a specific and consistent care for his tools that bordered on ceremonial, cleaning and checking and hanging each one in its proper place before he moved to the next task, that he slept poorly on nights when the wind came from the northeast, and on those nights she could sometimes hear him moving around the cabin below the loft, tending the stove, pacing the 3 steps between the door and the table. One of those nights, about 3 weeks in, she came down the loft ladder. He was at the table with a cup of something, not coffee. She could smell it was the valerian root tea, Nathan's recipe, she'd come to understand. Sorry, she said. I wasn't trying to. I heard you moving. I didn't mean to wake you. You didn't. She hesitated at the bottom of the ladder, not sure if she was intruding on something private. Do you want company, or would you rather I go back up? He considered this for a moment. It was she was learning how he operated, not dismissing the question but actually thinking about the answer before he produced it. You can sit down, he said. She sat in the mismatched chair across the table. The stove was burning steady. Outside the wind was doing that northeast thing. Not violent, but persistent. A low, continuous pressure. Is it always the northeast wind? She asked. He looked at her over the cup. What? That keeps you up. I've noticed it's when the wind comes from the northeast. He was quiet for a moment. Nathan died in a northeast wind, he said. Not because of it. He'd been sick for weeks, but that was the night. He wrapped both hands around the cup. The brain does what it does. She didn't offer anything about that. No comfort, no response designed to make the moment smaller than it was. She just sat with it. After a while, she asked, what was he like? Silas talked about Nathan Dre for the better part of an hour. He didn't do it in an organized or sentimental way. He moved between memories in the non-linear fashion of someone who had not talked about this person to another human being in a long time, jumping from the first winter they'd spent on the property to a specific afternoon the following spring when Nathan had gotten his boot stuck in a beaver dam and the whole bank had given way, to Nathan's habit of naming every significant tree within half a mile of the cabin, to the way he'd sung to himself without seeming to notice he was doing it. Naomi listened. She asked small questions when they seemed welcome. She didn't fill the silences with anything unnecessary. By the end, Silas was looking at the table rather than at her, and his voice had gotten quieter. He was a better man than the world gave him credit for, he said. It was the same sentence he'd used in the shelter during the storm, which told her it was something he'd thought a lot but rarely said. I think you probably knew that, she said, while he was here. I hope so. She went back up to the loft when the valerian had done whatever it was going to do and his eyes had started to close. She lay in the dark and thought about Nathan Dre, who had labeled herb jars in a careful hand and sung to himself and been someone's better self. She thought about the fact that for the first time in her life, she was in a place where her past, the particular story of embarrassment and obligation that her family had made her, had no purchase. Nobody on this mountain knew about the laundry bundles or the fainting couch or the $1,200 paid to Clement Hod. The mountain only had what she brought to it every day. She was beginning to understand why Silas wouldn't sell. The avalanche happened on a Wednesday. She knew it was Wednesday because Silas kept a rough calendar tacked to the wall beside the workbench and crossed off days in the morning, and she'd been doing it herself for the past week because she found the act of crossing off a day oddly satisfying. The physical marking of time actually passed. They were on the upper trail together because one of the long-line traps had needed resetting, and it required two people to manage the deadfall mechanism safely. Barnabas was with them, carrying the packs of supplies Silas had been redistributing between the cabin and the outbuilding for better weight management, canned goods, extra ammunition, 2 heavy coils of rope. Naomi heard it before she understood what it was. A sound like the mountain clearing its throat. She turned toward it instinctively, looking upslope to the right, and what she saw was not, for a fraction of a second, anything her brain had a ready category for. A line of white moving. A wall of white moving, with a sound building behind it that she felt in her teeth before she fully registered it with her ears. Run! Silas started, and then the leading edge of the snow mass hit the trail above them, and the world became noise and white and force. She ran left, where the tree line was dense enough to provide some anchor, and grabbed the nearest trunk with both arms and pressed herself against it. Snow hit her like a physical weight. Not the whole mass, she was at the edge of it, but enough to drive the breath from her body and bury her legs to mid-thigh. The noise lasted perhaps 15 seconds. It felt like a great deal longer. When it stopped, she was still standing, still holding the tree, legs packed in snow up to her hip on the left side, her face coated in ice crystals, and there was a ringing in her ears that faded slowly. Silas. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. Here. His voice was 20 feet away and to her right, and had a quality in it she hadn't heard before. Tight, controlled, the voice of someone managing something. She turned. The snow had rearranged the trail entirely. A new landscape where the familiar markers had been, everything white and disorganized and wrong. Barnabas was there. She could hear him. The sound of the mule's distress very clear and very immediate. But she couldn't see Silas yet. She pushed against the snow and found it didn't move easily, and dropped to her hands and started pulling herself through it rather than trying to walk, and covered the 20 feet on hands and knees and came around a broken pine to see the situation. The trail dropped away to the right where the avalanche had taken the edge with it. A clean fall, 20 feet down to a lower slope, and the snow was still settling at the bottom in small sliding adjustments. Barnabas was at the lip of this drop, and the coils of rope that had been in his pack had caught on a fractured pine stump at the trail's edge and were holding him from going over. But the mule was panicking, legs scrabbling, and the stump was splintering. Silas had Barnabas by the halter. But the rope from the pack was wrapped twice around Silas's right arm, and the mule's panicking weight was pulling him toward the edge. "Let go of the halter," Naomi said. "If he goes over, let go of the halter and brace against me." She was already moving to him, getting her body between his and the drop, planting her feet as wide as the narrow remaining trail allowed. She was heavier than Silas. This was simply true, had always been a fact used as a weapon against her. But on this trail on this morning, it was just a physical fact like any other. And she planted herself and wrapped both arms around his chest from behind and dug her heels in. "The rope's going to—" "I know." She could feel the weight of the mule through his body, through her arms, through her heels in the snow. It was enormous. It was beyond what any calculation she might have made would have suggested she could hold. But she didn't make any calculations. She just held. Barnabas lurched once, violently, and the stump cracked but held, and Naomi's heels carved 2 lines in the snow, but she didn't go forward. And then the mule found his footing somehow, a ledge, or a compacted patch, or pure animal luck. And the pulling stopped. She held for another 5 seconds, not trusting it. Then the rope went slack. Barnabas was standing on the trail, legs shaking, sides heaving, very alive. Silas unwound the rope from his arm. His hands were shaking. He turned around and looked at her. She was breathing hard. Her heels had carved maybe 8 inches toward the edge before they'd stopped. She looked down at those 2 lines in the snow and then back up at him. "The rope was going to take you over with him," she said. He was still looking at her. His face had done something she'd never seen it do. All the control had gone out of it, just for a moment, leaving something raw and unguarded that he probably didn't know was showing. "Yes," he said. "So." She straightened up. Her back was going to make her pay for this tomorrow. "You're welcome." He let out a breath that was half something else. Not quite a laugh, but the cousin of one. A release rather than amusement. He put both hands on her shoulders. Not romantically. It wasn't that kind of gesture. It was the way you'd grab someone you'd just seen nearly die, an instinctive confirmation of their continued physical presence. "You could have let us both go," he said. "That seemed like a bad outcome." "You didn't have to." He stopped. His hands dropped from her shoulders. He looked at Barnabas, who was settling, whose breathing was slowing. Then he looked back at her. "I need you to understand that most people would have gotten out of the way." "I'm not most people," she said. "You've had 3 weeks to figure that out." He looked at her for a long moment with that settled, direct look. Then he said, "Let's get him home." The way he said home, casual, reflexive, unconscious, registered somewhere in her chest. He'd said it as though the cabin were home for both of them, which was perhaps what it had become, somewhere in the accumulation of crossed-off days. She didn't point this out. She just helped him calm Barnabas and redistribute what remained of the load and turn back down the trail. Her legs didn't stop shaking for another hour. She didn't tell Silas this either. That night he made the dinner himself. A better-than-usual effort, something involving the smoked venison and the dried onions and a small amount of the preserved tomatoes he normally rationed carefully, which combined into something that was, by the standards of Mountain January, close to remarkable. They ate mostly in silence, which was not uncomfortable silence. It was the particular quiet of 2 people who have been through something together and are still processing it in their respective ways. Halfway through, Silas said, without preamble, "You're stronger than I thought." She looked up. "I don't mean—" He seemed to be choosing words with care. "I don't mean it as a surprise. I mean it as a fact I've revised upward. considerably, from where I started. She considered this. From where you started was pretty low, she said. Yeah. He said it without apology, but also without defensiveness. Just acknowledgement. I had a picture in my head of what the situation was going to be. You weren't part of it. I had to revise. And now? He looked at her. He had the kind of face that had been weathered to a point where expressions moved across it rather than through it, but she'd been watching it for 3 weeks and she was learning to read the small things. The thing happening in his face right now was not small. Now, I'm not sure the mountain is going to be the hardest thing I deal with this winter, he said. She understood what he was saying. She understood it precisely, and it was the most frightening and the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years, and she felt it the way you feel weather coming. Not as something that's happened yet, but as a change in pressure, a shift in the air. She looked back at her plate. Eat your dinner, she said, before it gets cold. He was quiet. Then, yes, ma'am. She kept her eyes on her plate, but she was smiling. She was almost certain he was too. The days that followed had a different quality, still hard, still demanding, still governed entirely by the mountain's indifferent requirements. But something had shifted in the texture of them. It wasn't that they were warmer toward each other. It was more that they had stopped performing in the way that two strangers are always, to some degree, performing for each other. They moved around the cabin and the property with the easy, unself-conscious coordination of people who have developed, without planning to, a working map of how the other person moves. She knew he'd want the workbench cleared before he came in from the trap line so he could lay out what he'd brought. He knew she'd need the south window unobstructed in the morning because that was where the light was good for the sewing repair work she'd taken on without being asked. Rips and worn seams in his working clothes, things she'd noticed needed doing and had simply done. Neither of them commented on these adjustments. They just made them. There was a morning, perhaps a week after the avalanche, when she was up before him. Unusual, because he was typically moving before full light. And she'd gone out to check on Barnabas and came back in to find Silas standing at the stove with his back to the door. And she had said, quietly, "Coffee's in the pot." And he turned around and looked at her with the expression of a man who has been startled not by a noise but by a feeling, which was something different and harder to recover from. "Thanks," he said. "I used the good grounds," she said. "I figured you needed it." He'd looked at her for just a moment too long before he turned back to the stove. "How did you figure that?" "You had the northeast wind last night." He was quiet. He poured the coffee. He drank it. He didn't say anything else about it. But later that day, when she was struggling with the larger of the two axe handles, it had cracked, and she was trying to replace it with a split of ash she'd found in the woodpile, using techniques she'd watched him use but hadn't fully mastered. She heard him come up behind her, and he didn't take the axe from her hands. He just stood at her left side and said, "Angle it here, not there. You want the grain running this way, or it'll crack again." She adjusted her grip accordingly. "Better," he said, and walked away. She split 5 hours of firewood with that handle over the following week. It didn't crack. A letter arrived in the 3rd week of February, carried up by a young man named Court, who came from the valley periodically with mail and small supplies and news of what had happened below since the last time. Court was perhaps 20, tall and thin, with an expressive, easily read face and a habit of delivering information in the order. He remembered it rather than in any order of importance. He brought flour, 2 cans of coal oil, a bar of lye soap, a packet of letters from what appeared to be a regional land registry office, and the information that a man named Fletcher had been up to something in Harwick Junction. Silas went still. "What kind of something?" "Been talking to people," Court said, accepting the mug of coffee Naomi put in front of him with the uncomplicated gratitude of a young man who was cold and had just come up a mountain. "Asking around about you, mostly. Who you talk to, who's up here with you." He glanced at Naomi with evident curiosity. "People in town know about the situation, the mail order thing. Hod, I mean. It kind of got around." "Of course it did," Naomi said. Fletcher was asking some specific questions. Court wrapped both hands around the mug. "About whether the marriage is legal. Whether you two are actually, legally tied." Silas looked at the packet of letters from the land registry without touching it. Why does that matter to him? Court shrugged with the easy helplessness of a messenger who carries news but not its logic. "I don't know the full of it, but the way the guy at the land registry office was telling it, something about if the property owner's got no legal family, and there's some kind of question about the ownership status, then the consortium has a cleaner path to file against the title. He looked between them. I'm just saying what I heard. Silas opened the registry letter. Naomi watched his face as he read. He had the stillness of someone keeping a careful lid on something, which was not his usual stillness. He set the letter down. He looked at court. When is the magistrate scheduled for Harwick? End of the month. Maybe sooner if the pass clears. Send word when you get down. I need to be there. Court nodded, drank his coffee, and accepted the bundle of dried venison Naomi put together for his return trip. He left the way he'd come, with the easy athleticism of someone who had grown up moving in snow and found it unremarkable. After he was gone, Naomi looked at Silas. Fletcher is trying to challenge your title. He's trying to find a leverage point. Silas folded the letter and held it. If the property has no clear heir and the ownership is contested, the consortium can file for an administrative review. It takes time and money to fight, and they're betting I don't have enough of either. Does your title have a weakness? He was quiet for a moment. Nathan's name was on the original deed. We filed a revised deed after he died, just my name, but it was a rough filing, done by the local magistrate who was retiring and didn't do the cleanest paperwork in his last months. Fletcher's lawyers probably found the gap. Is the gap real? Real enough to cost me a year and most of what I have to defend against it in a proper court. She absorbed this. So the marriage, a legal marriage, establishes me as a man with a household and a clear succession of interest in the property. It makes the administrative challenge harder to bring. He looked at the letter again. It's not a solution, but it closes the easiest door he's got. That's why he was asking in town whether we're legally married. Yes. She thought about Clement Hod, who had taken $1,200 and signed her name to letters she never wrote and sent her across the country to a mountain in Montana in January, and how his greed had created, entirely by accident, exactly the complication that was now being exploited by Fletcher's lawyers. She thought about the way bad actors sometimes built such complex structures of self-interest that they ended up entangling people who had nothing to do with their original intention. The magistrate comes at the end of the month, she said. Yes. She looked at him directly. Then let's make sure he has something to file when he gets here. Silas met her eyes. Outside, the northwest wind was doing its steady, honest work against the cabin walls. Not the northeast. Not the kind that kept either of them awake. Just the ordinary pressure of a mountain in winter saying, I am here, I am large, I do not care about your problems, manage them yourselves. She thought that was about right. The magistrate came on the 26th of February, which was earlier than anyone expected and later than Silas had hoped. His name was Aldous Crane, and he arrived on horseback, with a deputy and a leather satchel so overstuffed with documents that the buckle had given up and been replaced with a length of twine. He was a small, precise man of perhaps 60, with the particular manner of someone who had spent decades doing important things in uncomfortable places and had arrived at a kind of cheerful implacability about both. He shook Silas's hand at the door and looked past him at Naomi with open, uncomplicated assessment. Miss Ashcroft, he said. Mr. Crane. You're younger than I expected. He said it without cruelty, just as information. Hod's paperwork had you older. Hod's paperwork had me a lot of things I wasn't, she said. Crane made a sound that acknowledged this as a complete and accurate statement and stepped inside. His deputy, a large young man who introduced himself only as Burris and seemed content to remain near the door, stood against the wall while Crane settled at the table and opened his satchel. The ceremony itself took 11 minutes. Crane asked the necessary questions in the brisk, professional manner of a man who had performed this function many times under many varying circumstances and considered the solemnity to be in the substance rather than the duration. Silas answered in a steady voice. Naomi answered in a steady voice. They signed the register Crane produced from the satchel, and Crane signed it, and Burris signed it as witness, and then it was done. She was legally Naomi Mercer. She turned the name over in her mind the way you turn a stone over to see its underside. Naomi Mercer. It fit differently than Ashcroft had. Not better or worse yet, just different, the way any new thing fits differently before you've carried it long enough to know its weight. Crane pulled out the second set of documents before Silas could ask. The title matter, he said. I reviewed the filing situation before I came up. The original Mercer Dre deed and the subsequent single-name revision. He spread papers on the table. Your instinct was correct. The revision has a procedural deficiency. Magistrate Hooper filed it during his last month and missed 2 of the required attestation signatures. He looked at Silas over the papers. Fletcher's people found it. They filed a preliminary challenge with the Billings Land Court 3 weeks ago. Naomi watched Silas's jaw. On what grounds? Unclear succession of interest and deficient title revision. Standard language for this kind of challenge. Crane folded his hands. The good news is that a deficient revision is correctable. The bad news is that corrections filed after a challenge has been registered require a court hearing, not just a clerical amendment. You'll need a lawyer. I know one lawyer in Billings, Silas said. He charges what he charges. Is he good? Good enough. He paused. Can I correct the attestation signatures now, with you here? Crane considered this. I can witness a corrected filing, yes. It won't stop the hearing from being scheduled, but it strengthens your position significantly. He looked at the papers again. The question is who provides the second attestation. The original filing required 2 witnesses of legal standing in the territory. I'll do it, Naomi said. Both men looked at her. I'm his wife, she said. As of 11 minutes ago, that's legal standing. Crane looked at Silas. Silas looked at Naomi. Something passed between them that wasn't a conversation so much as a confirmation of something they hadn't formally said yet. That'll do, Crane said. They spent the next 2 hours going through the corrected filing with the care of people who understood that paperwork done wrong in a hurry was how you... Crane was thorough to the point of mild tedium, checking each clause and each signature against the territory's requirements. His deputy Burris ate 3 of the biscuits Naomi had made that morning and looked at the walls. When it was done, Crane gathered his documents, retied his satchel with the twine, and accepted the coffee she put in front of him. He drank half of it and looked around the cabin with the considering eye of a man tallying what he saw. You've been here how long, Mrs. Mercer? 6 weeks, she said. He nodded as though this confirmed something. The challenge hearing will be in Billings, likely in May or June. You'll want to be there. He finished the coffee. Fletcher's consortium has done this before. They know how to make a straightforward case look complicated, and they know that most homesteaders don't have the resources to fight prolonged litigation. He stood and pulled on his coat. Get your lawyer. Get your paperwork in order, and don't let them separate you from this property before the hearing. What does that mean? Silas said. It means sometimes these things move in ways beyond the courtroom. He said it plainly, without drama, the way you state a weather fact. I'm not suggesting anything specific will happen. I'm saying Fletcher is a man who plays a long game and doesn't restrict himself to legal instruments when other instruments are available. He looked at Naomi briefly. Just a glance, but she caught something in it. You have more to offer this case than you might think, Mrs. Mercer. A properly documented household is a harder target than a solitary man on contested land. He left with Burris, the 2 of them going back down the mountain in the gray afternoon light, with the particular unhurried confidence of men who knew the trail. Naomi stood at the cabin door and watched them go. He was warning us about something specific, she said. Yes. Silas was behind her, reading the copies of the filed documents Crane had left. Fletcher has used people before, sent them up to properties he was contesting, caused damage, disturbed livestock, made things difficult in ways that don't leave a clean line back to him. Did court know this? Court knows the surface of things. This is below the surface. She came back inside and closed the door. The cabin had the specific quality of a space that had just been occupied by several people and was now returning to itself. A settling, a re-establishment of its ordinary atmosphere. She stood in the middle of it and looked at Silas, who was at the table with papers. How long have you known Fletcher was a genuine threat and not just an irritant? He set the papers down. He had the look of a man deciding whether to answer the surface of the question or its actual depth. He chose the depth. Since last October, he had a man at the property line with a survey instrument claiming it was an error check on the township boundaries. The survey was legitimate. The results he filed were not. He picked up the papers again. He moved the recorded line 11 feet. 11 feet. 11 feet? In the right direction, on paper, puts the main trail access on his side of the property boundary. He looked at her. He's been building this for a year. The Hooper deed deficiency, the boundary adjustment, the title challenge. They're all pieces of the same thing. Naomi pulled out the other chair and sat across from him. You need those original survey stakes, she said. He looked at her. If the correct boundary was surveyed before Fletcher's man filed his adjusted version, and you still have the original stakes in the ground, a court surveyor can compare the two filings and identify the discrepancy. She'd learned this not from any legal education, but from a summer she'd spent at age 14 doing filing work for a Philadelphia land title office, which had been underpaid and undervalued, and which had turned out, sitting at a table in Montana in February, to be possibly the most useful thing she'd done in her life. Do you still have the original survey stakes? I have the original survey filing. That's different from having the physical stakes, she thought. Are they still in this ground? He stopped. I don't know. I haven't checked since October. Then we need to check. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite what she'd seen from him before, something that went slightly beyond the working partner regard she'd grown accustomed to. How do you know about survey stakes? He said. I filed documents for a land title office for 4 months when I was 14. She said it matter-of-factly. They paid me less than a man would have made doing the same work, and the office manager smelled like cabbage, but I paid attention. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Of course you did. The tree fell on a Sunday. She knew it was a Sunday because she'd just crossed the day off on the calendar, which Silas had started allowing her to do after she'd told him it was the most satisfying part of her morning. The calendar notation read survey stakes, east property line in her handwriting, a reminder she'd made the previous week when they'd talked about going to check and then been prevented by 3 consecutive days of heavy snow. The storm that Sunday had come from the northwest, the ordinary kind, not the kind that kept Silas awake, and had built through the afternoon into something more serious than the morning had suggested. By early evening, the wind had moved from steady to purposeful, driving snow against the south-facing walls with enough force to be audible as a sustained hiss. They were both inside. Silas was working on a section of trap mechanism at the workbench. Naomi was at the table with Nathan's herb notes, which she'd been systematically working through for 2 weeks, cross-referencing the labeled jars with the descriptions in his careful handwriting, trying to build a complete picture of what was there and what it could do. She'd gotten reasonably proficient at a handful of the simpler preparations: the yarrow and willow bark for fever and pain, the arnica preparation for bruising, a poultice from the pine resin that she'd used twice already on Silas's hands when the cold cracked his knuckles open. She did not oversell any of this. She tested things carefully, on small problems first, and she wrote down what she observed. Nathan's notes were good, but incomplete, the notes of a man who'd kept the detailed knowledge in his head and the written record as a supplement. She was working on deciphering a crossed-out section about the nettles when she heard it, a sound like something very large and very certain, making a decision. Then, the impact. The north wall of the cabin buckled inward approximately 4 inches, which was, she understood in an immediate physical way, both too much and not enough. Not enough to collapse, which meant they weren't immediately dead. Too much to be anything less than serious structural failure. The stovepipe screamed. That was the word her mind produced. Not fell or shifted, but screamed, a metallic shriek as the impact moved through the roof structure and the pipe connection at the ceiling joint twisted. Silas was off the bench and at the north wall in perhaps 2 seconds. He put both hands on the logs and felt them, which was not something she'd have thought to do, but which she immediately understood, reading the wall with his hands the way you read anything you knew well. Pine, he said, off the north slope, big one. He moved to the door. Stay here. Silas, stay here. He was out the door before she could follow. She stayed for approximately 30 seconds, which was as long as she could hold the instruction against the sounds coming from outside. Not his voice, which was the problem, but the sounds the storm was making around the cabin, which now included something new and low and grinding that hadn't been there before. She put on her coat and went out. What she saw reorganized her understanding of the situation completely. The pine tree had come down from the north slope at an angle, driven by a combination of wind and root failure. She could see the root mass at the far end, a wall of frozen earth and exposed roots standing 8 feet tall where the tree had simply pulled free of the mountain. The trunk was enormous. She couldn't have wrapped both arms around it with 3 feet to spare. It had hit the cabin at the roofline, crushing approximately 4 feet of the north wall and the roof section above it, and it was lying there with its full weight on the structure. The north wall had not given way completely. The logs were old and dense and had absorbed the impact and deformed rather than failed, which was the difference between a survivable disaster and an unsurvivable one. Silas was under the tree. Not under the trunk, under a section of collapsed roof, in the space between the trunk and the north wall, on his hands and knees and not moving in a way that suggested he was making choices. Silas! She was at his side in 4 steps, on her knees in the snow, and she got her hands on his shoulders. "Talk to me." "Leg," he said. His voice was controlled, but the control was costing him something. "Right leg, something's on it." She looked. A section of the roof beam, one of the main support timbers, perhaps 1.5 feet in diameter, had come down when the roof failed and was lying across his right leg just below the knee. She could see in the thin light from the still-burning stove through the cabin's gaps that the leg was wrong, angled wrong, carrying the story of the impact in a way that a leg should not have to carry. She assessed this. She did not panic. She had noticed, over the past weeks, that she tended to get calmer as situations got worse, which was not something she'd known about herself before because her previous life had rarely provided adequate test conditions. "Can you feel your foot?" she said. "Yes." "That's good." She touched the roof beam. It was not the tree trunk, not the main weight of the pine, which was being partially supported by the damaged wall. This was a secondary beam, significant but not impossible. "I'm going to move this. Naomi, I know what I'm doing." She didn't fully, but she knew enough. She knew that the beam could not simply be lifted and moved without risking it rolling and landing somewhere worse. She needed a directional movement. She needed to lever it, not lift it. "There's the rope in the lean-to." Second hook on the left wall. She found it in the dark of the lean-to, where Barnabas was making sounds of profound disapproval about the evening's events. She found the rope by feel, found the second hook by running her hand along the wall until she hit it, took the rope back to where Silas was. She tied one end around the beam, a proper knot, not the kind that held and then let go, the kind Silas had taught her in the second week as a purely functional lesson about rope management. She ran the rope over the main trunk of the fallen pine, which was above the beam and would give her purchase. She wrapped the other end twice around her hands and waist. "When I pull, you move toward me," she said, "away from the wall. The beam is going to swing east when I pull it up and over. I'll control that with the rope. You just need to move 6 feet toward me. Can you do that?" He didn't answer immediately. She couldn't see his face well enough to read it. "Yes," he said. "On 3. She pulled. The rope cut into her hands through her gloves. The beam resisted, not with any intention, just with the pure mechanical stubbornness of weight and friction. And she adjusted her position and pulled with her back and legs rather than her arms, driving her feet into the snow, using every pound of herself as a counterweight. The beam moved. 6 inches. 12. "Now," she said. "Move now." She heard him moving, heard the sounds of a man dragging himself through snow with one working leg, and the particular sounds of someone in serious pain who is managing it through something that goes below ordinary will. The beam continued to rise, swinging east as she'd calculated. She controlled the rope with both hands and let it move the way she'd planned, slow and directed. It came free of his leg and settled against the trunk of the fallen pine with a sound like a door closing. She dropped to her knees beside him. He was out from under the roof collapse, lying in the snow to the west of the tree. His right leg was wrong in a way that was going to require everything she knew and several things she didn't. "Broken," he said before she could say anything. "I can tell." "I know." She got her hands on either side of the leg and felt it carefully, the way she'd seen Mrs. Peel feel a broken thing, not pressing, just the surface of contact, gathering information. The break was in the lower leg, below the knee, 2 points of displacement she could feel through the fabric of his trousers. Not through the skin. That was important. "Can you walk?" she said, and then immediately, "No, stupid question." She thought, "I need to get you inside before I do anything else. You'll go into shock out here." You will." She'd seen it happen with the laundry women in Philadelphia. Accidents, burns, impacts. the particular delayed response of a body that had absorbed a trauma and was still arguing with the fact of it. I need something for a splint. I need to stabilize it enough to move you. She found 2 lengths of lumber in the lean-to, pieces Silas had cut for a repair project the previous month and not yet used. She brought them back, brought the spare rope from Barnabas's halter hook, knelt in the snow beside Silas, and did what she could do with what she had, which was not as much as she wanted, but more than nothing. This is going to be wrong in some ways, she said as she worked. I know that, but wrong and stable is better than right and unstable right now. He said nothing. His jaw was tight enough that she could see it even in the bad light. I need you to tell me if I make it worse, she said. You're not making it worse. I need you to tell me if I do. All right. Getting him inside was the most physically demanding thing she had done in her life, including the avalanche, because the avalanche had been short and intense. And this was sustained and required not just strength, but coordination and problem solving and the management of another human being's pain, which was a different kind of demand than managing your own. She moved him in stages, his shoulders first to a seated position, then his arm over her shoulders, then the slow translation from the ground to one foot. He kept his weight off the right leg. She took as much of his body weight as she could, and she could take more than most people would have expected of her. And she moved him through the door and to the floor beside the stove. She put wood on the fire. She put water on to heat. She went back to Nathan's notes. She'd read the broken bone entries twice before this. In the careful way she read everything in the notes, for information, not emergency. Now she read them for emergency, which was different. Faster, but also more focused. Every word weighted. Willow bark tea for the pain, as much as she could get into a strong preparation. The pine resin had a secondary use she'd noted but not fully understood until now. Nathan had written for setting injuries, slows bleeding beneath the skin, reduces swelling at fracture site. She mixed what she had. She knelt beside Silas on the cabin floor and looked at him. He was pale in the way of someone who had spent considerable energy not showing how much he was hurting. The stove was building warmth and the light was orange and steady. I need to set it, she said. I know. I have never done this before. I know that too. He looked at her. His eyes were very direct, which was, she had come to understand, how he expressed trust, not through softness, but through the steady, unwavering quality of his attention. You've done everything else. Do this. She did it. She didn't do it perfectly. She did it as well as she could with the knowledge she had and the materials available, which was not the same as perfectly, but was not as far from it as she'd feared. He made one sound when she set the bone, one sound, not a word, that she heard and registered and filed in a place she would not look at again for some time. After that she worked in silence, and he endured in silence, and the stove burned, and outside the storm continued its indifferent work. When it was done, splinted, bound, elevated on a folded blanket, the first dose of willow bark tea in his hand, she sat back on her heels on the cabin floor and her hands shook for about 30 seconds and then stopped. You did good, Silas said. We'll see, she said. I need to get up to the roof in the morning and assess the damage. It can wait. If I wait and there's more structural failure, we lose the north wall in the next storm. She stood up, joints protesting. I'll look in the morning when I can see. Naomi. She looked at him. Sit down for a minute. She sat. The floor was not comfortable, but she was past caring about comfortable. She pulled her knees up and looked at him across the small space between them. This man she'd known for 6 weeks, whom she'd met in a train depot, whose land was being stolen by a man in a clean coat, whose partner was buried on a ridge, whose broken leg she'd just set on a cabin floor in a Montana blizzard. Does it hurt a lot? She said. Yes. The tea will start to work in about 20 minutes. She paused. I think. You think. Nathan's notes say 20 minutes. Nathan's notes are generally reliable. She looked at the shelf of jars. He was careful. He wrote what he actually observed, not what he thought he should see. That was Nathan. Silas drank the tea slowly. It wasn't good. Willow bark tea was not good. That was one of its consistent properties. But he drank it without complaint. He used to say the difference between knowledge and opinion was whether you'd checked. Smart man. Smartest man I've known. He looked at the fire. He would have liked you. She felt the weight of that. Not as a romantic statement. It wasn't that. and she understood it wasn't, but as something more specific and more important. The judgment of a man Silas trusted extended forward through Silas's own trust. "That means something," she said, "coming from you." He looked at her. "It should." She got up and added wood to the stove. She checked the splint, adjusted the elevation. She went to the north wall and put her hands on it the way he had, feeling the logs, reading them. The damage was significant, but the wall wasn't moving. It had absorbed and stopped. She put on her coat and went out into the storm one more time, because the rope she'd used to lever the beam was still out there, and rope on this mountain was not something you left in the snow if you could avoid it. She coiled it and brought it in and hung it on its hook. Back inside, she hung her coat, checked the stove, checked Silas, who was losing his battle with the willow bark and exhaustion combined and going towards sleep in the way of a body that has finally been given permission. She pulled the second chair close to the stove and sat in it. Her hands were blistered inside her gloves from the rope. She looked at them in the firelight, the red lines across both palms, the beginning of what would be proper blisters by morning. She closed her fingers over them. Outside, the storm made its sounds. The damaged north wall held. The stove burned on. In the loft above the ladder, which she did not go up to tonight because she was not going to leave him down here alone, she could see the edge of the blanket she'd folded that morning, the ordinary evidence of a morning that had been entirely different from the night that followed. She thought about Fletcher and his clean coat. She thought about billings and land courts and title hearings in May or June. She thought about survey stakes in the frozen ground on the east property line, which nobody had checked yet. She thought about Nathan Dre, who had known which plants did what, and who was buried on the ridge, and who had been a better man than the world gave him credit for. She sat in the chair, and she did not sleep. She kept the fire, and she kept watch, and outside the pine tree lay against the wall of the cabin in the snow, very large and very still, already becoming just another thing the mountain had done that they were going to have to deal with tomorrow. Tomorrow there was the roof to assess, and the supply count to check, and the water barrel situation to manage, and the east property line to eventually reach, and a court hearing somewhere in their future, and a man named Fletcher who played a long game. But tonight the stove was burning and the wall was holding and Silas Mercer was asleep. That was for tonight enough. The roof took 4 days to repair properly, which was 3 days longer than Naomi had hoped, and 1 day shorter than she'd feared. She'd gone up the morning after the storm, while Silas was still sleeping, climbing the exterior wall with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood that a second injury on this property right now would move them from difficult to impossible. What she found was serious but not catastrophic. The fallen pine had crushed approximately 8 feet of roofline at the north corner, collapsing 2 of the main support beams and destroying the bark and sod layering that served as the roof's weatherproofing. The structural logs beneath were damaged but not severed. The pine itself had partially bridged the gap it created, which was the only reason the entire north section hadn't come down. She came back inside and described what she'd seen to Silas in precise terms, because he asked precise questions and vague answers frustrated him, and she had stopped offering vague answers some weeks ago. "The 2 support beams," he said. He was propped against the south wall with his leg elevated, his face carrying the specific controlled expression of a man managing pain he considered insufficient reason to stop thinking. "There's replacement timber in the outbuilding, back left corner, the longer pieces. I cut them last fall for the lean-to expansion I never got to. Are they the right dimension? Close enough. You'll need to notch them to seat in the wall logs. There's a draw knife on the second hook of the workbench. I know where it is." "Right." He looked at the ceiling, doing something internal. "The sod layer. You can pull material from the east side of the lean-to roof. That section's doubled up. I overbuilt it. Take the top layer." She wrote none of this down because she had found she rarely needed to. The work itself was slow and cold and occasionally frightening. There were 2 moments on the roof when the wind came up and she was holding a beam section and had to stop and simply wait with her weight distributed carefully until the gust passed. She did not tell Silas about these moments. He would have told her to be careful, and she was already being careful, and the additional telling would have cost him something in anxiety that she didn't see the point of. What she told him instead, each evening, was what she'd accomplished and what remained. He listened and asked questions, and occasionally said, "Try it this way instead," with the authority of a man who had built and repaired this structure many times and knew where it would resist and where it would cooperate. On the second day, Court appeared unexpectedly, having come up to check on them after hearing about the storm's severity in the valley. He took one look at the situation, the tree, the roof, Silas's leg, and his young face went through several expressions in rapid succession before settling on practical. "Tell me what to do," he said to Naomi. She told him. He did it without argument, which she appreciated, and he was stronger than he looked. And between the two of them, they managed the beam replacement in a single afternoon that would have taken her 2 days alone. She paid him in the smoked venison that Silas directed her to, and in the information about the title hearing, which Court received with the wide-eyed seriousness of someone encountering adult complexity and recognizing it as such. "Fletcher's been down in Harwick again," Court said, eating his venison at the table while Naomi cleaned the tools. "2 men with him I didn't recognize, not from around here." Silas, from his position against the south wall. "What kind of men?" "Lawyer kind. The way they dress, the way they talk." Court chewed. "They were at the land office for most of a morning. The clerk, Peterman, you know Peterman. He wouldn't say what they were looking at, but he had a face on him like a man who'd just been told to do something he didn't like." "Peterman's Fletcher's man?" Naomi said. "More like Fletcher's convenient man," Silas said. "He's not bought. He just doesn't like trouble, and Fletcher is very good at presenting himself as the path of least trouble." He shifted his leg, and the effort of keeping his face neutral cost him a visible fraction of a second. "What else?" "There's a man, staying at the Harwick Hotel, been there 2 weeks, asks questions around town, casual, like he's just passing through, but he's not just passing through. Nobody who's just passing through stays 2 weeks in Harwick in February." Court looked at Silas. "He asked about you specifically, about who lives up here, how many people." The cabin went quiet except for the stove. "Description," Silas said. "Medium height, brown coat, 40s maybe. Quiet." Court seemed to be pulling the image up from wherever he stored things he'd noticed. "Has a way of standing that makes you think he's been in situations where standing wrong was a problem." Silas and Naomi looked at each other across the room. "All right," Silas said. "Thank you, Court." After Court left, she sat across from Silas, and they stayed with what they'd just heard for a moment. "Fletcher is escalating," she said. "He knows about the title filing correction. Crane would have submitted it to the billings court by now." He rubbed his jaw. "That closes the easy door, so he's looking at other doors. The man at the hotel. Maybe. Or maybe he's just gathering information, and the man is a surveyor or a journalist or someone's traveling relative." He said this in a tone that indicated he didn't believe any of those alternatives. "You said he'd used people before, caused damage. To other properties. Not mine. Not yet." He paused. "He may be thinking about it now." She looked at the north wall where the repair was holding and the new beam sections were seated clean and solid. She thought about everything the cabin represented. Nathan's herb jars, the mismatched chairs, the calendar with its crossed-off days, the 12 years of work and partnership buried in the ridge above the east meadow. "Let him come," she said. Silas looked at her. "I mean it. Whatever he sends up here, surveyor, lawyer, someone with worse intentions, let him come. We're here. We're documented. We're married, and the title is corrected, and we're not going anywhere." She met his eyes. "He's betting on you being alone and isolated and exhausted. He miscounted." Something settled in Silas's face. Not relief exactly. Something older and steadier than relief. "Yes, he did," he said. The days of Silas's recovery organized themselves around the unchangeable requirements of the property, and Naomi organized herself around those requirements with a consistency that surprised her in retrospect, though it didn't surprise her in the moment because in the moment there was simply the next task, and then the next one after that. She ran the trapline alone for the first time in the 3rd week of March, which required going further than she'd gone without Silas and navigating the trail markers on her own. She made 2 errors. Went left when she should have gone right at the split above the east meadow, realized it within 100 yards because the markers stopped, backtracked, found the correct branch. She reset 4 traps. She brought back 2 rabbits and a marten. She cleaned and prepped all 3 in the lean-to before she came inside, because she'd noticed Silas was particular about not bringing unprepped animals into the cabin. When she came in, he looked at what she'd brought and said nothing for a moment. "The marten was in the 4th trap," she said. "The one you said you'd barely gotten any use out of." "I'll be damned," he said. Apparently the location just needed someone with better luck. He laughed. It was the first real laugh she'd gotten out of him, not the controlled almost laugh from the avalanche morning, but an actual laugh, unmanaged and slightly rusty sounding, like something that had been in storage. She felt it in a way she didn't entirely know what to do with. His leg healed slowly and imperfectly, the way things healed on mountains in winter without proper medical supervision. By early March, he could put weight on it with the crutch she'd fashioned from a forked branch and a wrapped pad of folded canvas. By mid-March, he was moving around the cabin without it, slowly, with a limp that she suspected was going to be permanent in some reduced degree. She didn't say this. He didn't ask. They both knew. There was an afternoon in late March when the light changed. She noticed it first outside, a quality of the afternoon sun on the snow that was different from every afternoon sun that had come before it, warmer and more direct, reaching surfaces it hadn't reached in months. She stood in the yard for a moment and held her face up to it. Silas came out of the cabin behind her, moving carefully but moving. He stood beside her and looked at the same sky. "March light," he said. "It's different. Always is. First time you notice it on the mountain feels like the first time you've ever noticed it anywhere." She thought that was true and didn't say so. They stood there for a while in the changing light without talking, and this was not uncomfortable, which was itself a kind of information about how far things had come since the depot in January. It was in April that the stranger appeared. Naomi was alone. Silas had gone up to the north trap line, the first time he'd managed it without her, on a clear morning, moving slowly but clearly, needing to go. And she was in the yard splitting wood when she heard Barnabas make the particular sound he made when something unfamiliar entered his perimeter. She set the axe in the block and waited. The man who came out of the tree line was the medium height, brown coat, 40s, maybe that Court had described. He walked with the easy manner of someone who wanted to appear unthreatening, which was itself, she had learned, a kind of threat signal. Genuinely unthreatening people didn't usually arrange themselves so deliberately. He stopped at the edge of the yard. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. Not a question. He knew who she was. "You know my name," she said. "I don't know yours." "Harlan Beach." He said it as though it were a credential rather than just a name. "I represent a group of investors with interests in this region's timber and transportation infrastructure." "Fletcher's Consortium," she said. A small adjustment in his expression, not surprise, more like recalibration. "I represent several clients, yes. And you've been in Harwick for 2 weeks, asking about who lives up here." Another recalibration. "I like to understand the properties I'm involved in evaluating." She looked at him steadily. She had her work gloves on and the axe was in the block, and she was standing in her own yard on her own property on a clear April morning, and she was not afraid. She noticed this without making a production of it. "What do you want, Mr. Beach?" "A conversation," he said. Nothing more. He took a few steps further into the yard, not aggressive, just closing the talking distance, which was a technique she recognized from people who worked in rooms where influence was the product. "I want to be honest with you, Mrs. Mercer. The consortium's position in the title challenge is strong. We have documentation of the procedural deficiencies in the original deed and the revision, and we have the boundary survey adjustment filed with the county." He paused. "A court hearing in Billings is going to be expensive, time-consuming, and uncertain, even with your recent corrected filing." "Your boundary adjustment is fraudulent," she said. "Our position is that it corrects an error in the original survey." "Your position is wrong." He looked at her in the way of a man who is used to conversations where his position, right or wrong, is the one that eventually wins by virtue of the resources behind it. "Mrs. Mercer, I'd like to make you an offer directly as someone who," he seemed to search for the right phrase, "as someone who wasn't born into this situation, who came to it from outside, who might have a clearer view of what's practical." "An offer," she said. "Fair market value for the property, plus a generous resettlement amount. Enough to start again somewhere with fewer challenges." He let the word land. "Your husband is not a young man. His leg is going to limit him. This is a hard property in a hard location, and the legal situation is going to get harder before it gets resolved, even under the best circumstances." He spread his hands. The same gesture Fletcher had used at the edge of town in January, she noticed. Perhaps it was taught. "A clean settlement now serves everyone." She looked at Harlan Beach for a long moment. She thought about Clement Hod pocketing $1,200 while she stood 3 feet away. She thought about her uncle saying find somewhere else to sleep by Friday. She thought about the way people throughout her life had looked at her and seen a problem to be managed, an inconvenience to be resolved, something that could be moved and placed and settled and dealt with. She thought about Nathan Dre, buried on the ridge, who had been a better man than the world gave him credit for. "Get off my property," she said. Beach blinked. The recalibration this time was larger. "Mrs. Mercer, I heard your offer. My answer is no. Get off my property." "I'd encourage you to think carefully before—" She pulled the axe from the block. Not threatening. She just pulled it free and held it in a working grip, because she had wood to split, and she intended to continue splitting it, and she wanted her hands to have something in them while she said what she was about to say. "I'm going to explain something to you, and I'd like you to hear it clearly. We have the original survey stakes on the east property line. We have documentation of the filing dates, which establishes that the original survey precedes your adjusted version by 11 years. We have a corrected title deed filed with the territorial magistrate and submitted to the Billings court. We have a legal marriage. We have a lawyer engaged in Billings, and we have a court date." She looked at him without any particular heat. Not angry, just clear. "Your consortium built this case on the assumption that Silas Mercer was an old man alone on a mountain with a disputed deed and no one who cared what happened to him. That assumption was wrong the day I arrived, and it's been getting wronger every week since." She shifted her grip on the axe. "Tell Fletcher whatever he's paid you to find out. We're here. We'll be here in May. We'll be here in June when the hearing is scheduled. If he wants the property, he can make his argument in court, and we'll make ours." Harlan Beach stood in the yard for a moment. He was recalibrating again, but this time there was something else in his expression. Something that might, if you were generous, have been the early beginning of respect, though she didn't particularly need it from him. He turned and walked back into the tree line. She stood in the yard until she couldn't hear his footsteps anymore. Then she split wood for another hour, because there was still wood to split, and the practical work of the property didn't stop because someone had come up from Billings to try to take it. She didn't tell Silas about Beach immediately. She told him that evening, directly and completely, the same way she told him everything, laying out what had happened, what had been said, what she'd said in return. She watched his face as she talked. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You told him about the survey stakes," he said. "Yes. We haven't actually verified they're still there." She looked at him. "I know. So you told him we had something we haven't confirmed we have." "I told him we have documentation of the original filing dates, which is true. The stakes being there makes our position stronger, but the filing dates are the foundation regardless." She paused. "But yes, we need to go check." He looked at her for a moment longer. That was a significant bluff. It wasn't entirely a bluff. And the look on his face when I said it told me I'd hit something real. He knew the filing dates were a problem for the adjusted survey. She met his eyes. "We need to go to that property line. My leg is functional enough for the East Meadow Trail if we take it slow." She had been watching his leg for 2 weeks and had a more precise assessment of it than he probably knew. "We go tomorrow if it's clear." It was clear. The east property line was 40 minutes from the cabin at their compromised pace. Silas with the crutch still, though more for security than necessity. Naomi carrying the pack with the documentation Crane had left them and a copy of the original survey map. Barnabas came because she'd brought him, not because they needed him for the trail, but because she'd found she trusted his reactions to the environment. The survey stakes were iron pins driven into the ground at 3-foot intervals along the boundary line. She'd never seen them, but knew them from the survey map description. The original survey, filed 11 years ago, had marked 9 pins along the east boundary. She found the first one 20 feet from where the map indicated, not because it had moved, but because the snow accumulation made it invisible until she dropped to her knees and swept the surface away. An iron pin, 3 feet of it above the soil when fully cleared, with the original surveyor's stamp still legible on the head. "It's here," she said. Silas leaned on his crutch above her and looked down. Something in his face shifted. Something she'd seen rarely, the thing that happened when the practical world confirmed something he'd needed to be confirmed. They found 7 of the 9 pins. 2 were genuinely gone, pulled or lost to years of freeze-thaw cycles, but 7 were enough. And the positions of the 7 were consistent with the original survey filing and inconsistent with Fletcher's adjusted boundary, which had moved the line precisely through the gap where the missing pins would have been. She photographed the pins' positions in relation to each other using the measurement technique she'd learned at the land title office. Distances, angles, reference points she could describe precisely in a written affidavit. She wrote everything down in the small notebook she'd started carrying after Crane's visit. "This is enough," she said. "This plus the filing dates," Silas said. "This plus the filing dates." He was looking at the iron pin she'd cleared, the small piece of metal that had been in the ground for 11 years waiting to be needed. "Nathan and I set these ourselves," he said. "We followed the surveyor up here, me and Nathan, while he placed them, because we wanted to know exactly where our land was." He was quiet. "Nathan said a man who doesn't know his own boundary can't defend it." She looked at the pin. She thought about Nathan Dre, who had known things and written them down and died in a northeast wind, and whose knowledge was still doing work 11 years later. "He was right," she said. They went back down to the cabin in the afternoon light, which had the spring quality now, that warmer, more direct reach, with the 7 documented stake positions in her notebook and the knowledge of what they were going to do with them. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived with court that changed everything. She recognized the legal letterhead from the Billings court. She'd seen it on Crane's documents. And she read it standing at the door before she'd even fully come inside. Silas watched her face. "What is it?" She read it twice. Then she handed it to him. He read it. She watched his face do what her face had done, move through the content, recognize what it was, arrive at the thing behind it. The letter was from a law firm in Philadelphia. Not Silas's Billings lawyer, Philadelphia. Her grandfather, Reginald Ashcroft, a man she had met precisely twice in her life, who had looked at her at both family gatherings with the distant assessment of a man confronted by evidence of his son's impractical marriage choices, had died in March. He had been, it emerged, not the minor figure of comfortable means that she'd understood him to be from family references, but a man of serious accumulated wealth in textile manufacturing and commercial real estate. The estate was being administered by a firm called Whitmore and Hall. The letter was addressed to Naomi Ashcroft Mercer. She was, by the terms of the will, the primary heir. "How much?" Silas said. His voice was neutral. She looked at the figure in the letter again. Even reading it twice, she had the persistent sensation that she was misreading it. "A great deal," she said. Enough to do almost anything." She sat down. "Enough for the Billings lawyers. Enough to counter Fletcher's litigation budget. Enough." She stopped. "A great deal." Silas was quiet. He set the letter on the table and looked at it from a slight distance, as though looking at it too directly might change what it said. "This changes your situation," he said. "Our situation," she said. "Naomi, our situation," she repeated, and there was something in her voice that stopped him. He looked at her. "I know what you're going to say," she said. "You're going to say that this money changes what's practical for me, and that I should think carefully about what I want, and that the arrangement we made was made under different circumstances, and I shouldn't feel—" She stopped herself, took a breath. "Don't. I'm saying you have options you didn't have before. I've always made my own options." She looked at him across the table. "Do you want me to go?" The question sat between them. He had a habit, when something was too important for his usual economy, of being very still. Not the stillness of distance, but the stillness of someone gathering themselves to say something they won't be able to unsay. She'd seen it 3 times. She recognized it now. "No," he said. "I don't want you to go." "Then I'm not going." "The money is ours if you'll stop performing selflessness long enough to acknowledge we could use it." She said it plainly, without softness, but also without hardness. "We have a court hearing in 2 months. Fletcher's lawyers have more resources than yours. We have 7 survey stakes and a corrected deed and a fraudulent boundary adjustment, and those things are going to carry the case, but having resources to present them properly will matter." She put her hand on the letter. "This is the difference between surviving the hearing and winning it decisively. I choose decisively." He was looking at her with an expression she didn't have a full inventory for, something large and uncategorized that his face was containing with some effort. "You tore up documents before?" he said. She frowned. "What?" "Just I want to make sure. If you were going to tear this letter up, I'd like to know before. I'm not tearing this letter up. This letter is useful. She paused. Are you making a joke? I'm attempting one, he said, apparently unsuccessfully. She looked at him. He looked back at her. The letter sat on the table between them, and outside the April light was doing its spring thing on the snow, reaching further than it had reached all winter, and Barnabas was making sounds of ordinary contentment in the lean-to. I'm going to write to Whitmore and Hall today, she said, and then I'm going to write to your Billings lawyer and tell him his budget just changed. She pulled the letter toward her. And then I need to finish the roof patch on the east corner before the snowmelt gets into it. Naomi, Silas said. She looked up. His face had done the thing, the unguarded thing, the thing that happened when all the weathering and control dropped back for a moment, and she could see what was actually underneath. It only lasted a second, but she saw it. Thank you, he said. It came out rougher than he probably intended. For all of it, everything you've... He stopped, which was unlike him. She understood what he meant. She understood it better than the words he hadn't quite managed. I know, she said. She got up and found the paper and the ink and sat back down at the table, and she began to write the letter to Philadelphia. And Silas sat across from her and read the Billings legal documents. And outside the mountain held them both in its vast, indifferent way, the way it held everything, without caring, without softening, without any consideration for human difficulty. Which was, she had come to understand, the closest thing to fairness she had ever lived inside. The mountain treated everything the same. It was only people who didn't. The road to Billings took 2 days by wagon, which was the first time Naomi had been off the mountain since January. She noticed things she hadn't noticed on the way up. Or rather, she noticed them differently, the way you notice the dimensions of a room after you've lived in it versus when you first walk in. The valley widened below the Beartooth foothills, and the sky opened in a way that felt almost excessive after months of timber and ridgeline framing it on every side. Towns appeared at intervals along the road, each one with its particular arrangement of ambition and compromise. A general store, a livery, a boarding house, a saloon, the optimistic beginnings of a church with no steeple yet. Silas drove. His leg had settled into something functional over the past 6 weeks. Not what it had been, but adequate for a wagon bench and for the limited walking a court appearance would require. He didn't complain about it. She'd stopped asking how it felt because his answer was always the same, fine, which meant anything from genuinely fine to considerable discomfort that he'd decided wasn't worth discussing. She'd learned to read the difference by watching how he shifted his weight when he thought she wasn't paying attention. She'd written to Whitmore and Hall in Philadelphia and received a detailed reply within 3 weeks, fast enough that she understood they'd been waiting for her response with some urgency. The estate was real, the figure was accurate, and the process of formal transfer would take several months of legal work. What she could access immediately was a smaller but still significant amount from a liquid account her grandfather had maintained separately, which Whitmore and Hall had released to the Billings lawyer, a man named Orrin Platt, upon her written authorization. Platt had sent his own letter shortly after, dense with legal language that she'd read twice at the table while Silas watched her face. His assessment was measured and careful. Their position was strong but not unassailable. The 7 survey stakes were significant. The filing date documentation was significant. The corrected deed was significant. And Fletcher's consortium had been doing this long enough to know how to make significant things seem complicated in front of a judge. Come prepared, he'd written at the end, and come ready to stay the week if necessary. They were prepared. She'd spent April making sure of it. The notebook she carried into Billings had 43 pages of documented observations, measurements, dates, and cross-references. She had copied, in her own hand, the relevant sections of Nathan's survey notes from 1877, which Silas had found in a tin box under the floorboards of the outbuilding. The kind of place a careful man puts things he wants to be sure survive a fire. She had written a precise account of Harlan Beach's visit to the property, including his exact words as she remembered them, signed and dated. She had written affidavits documenting the positions of the 7 survey stakes, cross-referenced to the original survey map. She had also, on a quieter impulse she didn't fully explain to Silas, written a separate account of everything she'd observed in the 6 months since January. The tasks she'd learned, the repairs she'd made, the trapline, the avalanche, the tree, the leg, the roof. Not for the court, just for herself. A record that said, "This happened, I was here, I did these things." She wasn't sure why she'd needed to write it down. She thought maybe it was because she'd spent a long time as someone whose existence other people narrated for her. The broker's letters, her family's assessments, the town's first impressions. And she wanted at least one account in her own handwriting. Billings was larger than she'd remembered from the train, though she'd passed through it in January barely awake from exhaustion and cold and hadn't taken much in. It had the particular energy of a place that was still deciding what it was going to be. Raw in some places, surprisingly established in others. The courthouse was brick, 3 stories, with the self-conscious solidity of a building that wanted to communicate permanence in a territory that had very little of it. Orrin Platt was a thin man of perhaps 55, precise and direct in his manner, with the quiet authority of someone who did not need to project confidence because his competence did that work for him. He met them at his office the evening before the hearing and went through everything she'd brought with a focused attention that she found immediately reassuring. He spent a long time on Nathan's survey notes from the tin box. "Where were these?" he said. "In storage on the property," Silas said. "We found them in April." Platt looked at the dates on the notes, 1877, written in Nathan's careful hand, recording measurements and reference points for the original boundary survey. "These predate Fletcher's adjusted filing by 11 years, he said. "Yes," Naomi said. "And the adjusted filing purports to correct an error in the original survey." "Yes." "So what we have is a set of contemporary field notes from the original survey in the hand of one of the original property holders, with measurements that are inconsistent with the correction claimed by Fletcher's filing." He set the notes down with the precision of a man placing something valuable. "Mrs. Mercer, how did you know to look for these?" "I didn't know specifically," she said. "I knew that Silas and Nathan had followed the original surveyor when the stakes were placed. Men who do that usually write things down." Platt looked at her for a moment, then he looked at Silas. "You found a good one," he said, in the tone of a man making a professional assessment. Silas said, "I know." She looked at the wall. The hearing the following morning was in a courtroom on the 2nd floor of the brick courthouse, a room that smelled like law books and old wood, and the particular airlessness of a space where important arguments had been happening for years. Fletcher's team occupied the table to the left, 3 lawyers, none of whom were Fletcher himself, who was apparently not present, which Platt had told them to expect. Men like Fletcher sent lawyers and stayed out of rooms where things could go wrong. The judge was a woman named Harriet Voss, which Naomi had not expected and which she absorbed without showing her surprise. Judge Voss was perhaps 60, gray-haired, with reading glasses she removed and replaced constantly as she moved between documents and the people speaking. She had the manner of someone who had heard a great deal of nonsense in her career and had developed an efficient system for identifying it early. Fletcher's lead lawyer was a man named Arlen Sprague, who had the practiced smoothness of someone who spent his professional life making complicated things sound simple and simple things sound complicated, depending on which direction served his purpose. He opened by describing the title "Deficiency in Language that made a procedural paperwork gap sound like evidence of fundamental instability in the Mercer claim." He described the boundary adjustment as a correction of a historical error supported by a survey conducted by a licensed professional. He spoke with the confident pace of a man who expected the weight of his firm's resources to do most of the actual arguing. Platt let him finish, then Platt presented the filing dates. The original survey, 1877. Fletcher's adjusted survey, 1887. 10 years of the original boundary standing unchallenged, undisputed, with no record of any complaint or claimed error from any party during that decade. Sprague started to respond. Platt presented Nathan's field notes. The courtroom went through a particular kind of quiet, not silence, but the specific reduction in ambient noise that happens when the people in a room understand that something important has just been put on a table. Judge Voss removed her glasses, looked at the notes, put her glasses back on, and looked at Sprague. "Mr. Sprague," she said, "your client's adjusted survey claims to correct an error in the original 1877 boundary placement. You have contemporary field notes from one of the original property holders, dated 1877, documenting the boundary positions at time of placement. Can you explain how those measurements are consistent with your client's claimed correction?" Sprague's practiced smoothness underwent a subtle adjustment. "Your Honor, The field notes of a non-professional surveyor are not equivalent to a licensed survey filing. I didn't ask about equivalence, Judge Voss said. I asked about consistency. Are the measurements consistent? A pause. We would need additional time to analyze. You've had the original survey filing since you filed the challenge, Mr. Sprague. The measurements in that filing are the same measurements in these notes. I'll ask again. Are they consistent with your client's claimed correction? Another pause, shorter this time, and what came out of it was a more careful version of the same answer arranged differently, which told everyone in the room that the answer was no. Platt presented the 7 survey stakes next. Her documentation, her measurements, the cross-references to the original filing, the affidavit she'd signed. He presented it systematically, without drama, in the manner of a man who understood that facts presented clearly were more persuasive than facts presented theatrically. Naomi sat at the table and watched Judge Voss read through the stake documentation. She watched the judge's face the way she'd learned to watch faces, not for what people chose to show, but for what moved underneath before they arranged it. What she saw in Judge Voss's face was a woman reading something that confirmed something she had already suspected. The hearing took the full day. Sprague's team called their own witnesses, the surveyor who'd done the adjusted filing, a land clerk from Harwick, who turned out to be Peterman, whose face in the witness chair had the quality of a man sitting in a room where he'd rather not be recognized. Platt cross-examined both of them with the patient precision of someone who knew exactly where the gaps were and was going to walk directly to each one. Peterman, under questioning, admitted that Fletcher's representative had brought him the adjusted survey filing already completed and asked him to register it. He had registered it. He had not independently verified the measurements. The Harwick courtroom 2 months ago would have found this unremarkable. In this room, in front of Judge Voss, it landed with a specific weight. The judge recessed at 4 in the afternoon and returned at 5:30 with a decision that was longer than Naomi had expected and clearer than she'd hoped. Fletcher's boundary adjustment was found to be inconsistent with the original survey documentation and the physical evidence of the property stakes, and was set aside. The procedural deficiency in the title revision was acknowledged, but found to have been corrected through the properly filed amendment with Magistrate Crane, a correction that predated the consortium's challenge and therefore superseded it. The Mercer title to the property, including the eastern boundary as established by the original 1877 survey, was affirmed. The challenge was dismissed. Naomi sat very still for a moment after the gavel came down. Beside her, Silas let out a breath that was longer and slower than a normal breath. The breath of a man releasing something he'd been holding for a long time. Platt was gathering his papers with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd gotten what he'd come for. Across the room, Sprague's team was having a muted conversation that didn't require much imagination to understand. "It's done," Platt said quietly. "Yes," Naomi said. She looked at Silas. He was looking at the front of the courtroom where Judge Voss had gone, and his face had the unguarded quality again. The thing that happened when he wasn't performing anything, just existing in the plain fact of a moment. Nathan would have come to something like this, Silas said. Not to her specifically, just said. Would have sat in the back and watched and had opinions about the whole proceeding. Strong opinions. About everything. Something moved across his face. He believed in documentation. He believed in writing things down. He looked at the notebook she still held in her hands. He would have recognized what you did. She thought about Nathan Dre, who had written field notes in 1877 and put them in a tin box under a floorboard, and how that careful act had crossed 11 years in a Montana winter and a Billings courtroom and had done its work in the end. She thought about how much of what mattered in the long run was simply the patient accumulation of accurate information in retrievable form. I think I would have liked him, she said. I know you would have, Silas said. They had dinner that night at a restaurant in Billings, an actual restaurant with a menu and a tablecloth, which felt slightly unreal after 6 months on the mountain. Naomi ordered the roast chicken and ate most of it and part of the breadbasket, and Silas drank one whiskey slowly and told her for the first time the story of how he and Nathan had come to the Montana property in the first place, which involved a poker game in Cheyenne, a mule purchased for the wrong reasons, and a map that turned out to be 30 years out of date. She laughed at the parts that were funny and asked questions at the parts that weren't, and Silas talked for nearly an hour in a way that she understood was unusual for him. Not just the length, but the looseness of it, the willingness to let the story go where it went without editing it into efficiency. Afterward, walking back to the hotel in the spring evening, he said, "You've been counting things." "What?" "Since the ruling, I can see it in your face. You're adding things up." She thought about this. "I was thinking about what Platt said. Several months for the estate transfer to complete. And? And what we could do with it, properly. Not just for the hearing." She walked beside him through the Billings evening, which had the sounds of a town that stayed awake later than a mountain cabin. "There's the north roof section that's still not right. The lean-to expansion you planned. The east meadow could support a proper kitchen garden with some work." She paused. "And I've been thinking about the water situation. Nathan's notes mention a spring on the northwest slope that he was going to route toward the cabin, but never got to." He was quiet for half a block. "You've been planning." "I've been thinking." "Since when?" "Since February, roughly." She kept walking. "Since I understood I wasn't going anywhere." He stopped walking. She took 2 more steps before she noticed and stopped as well, and turned to look at him. He was standing on the Billings boardwalk in the spring evening with his weight slightly favored to his good leg, and his face doing the unguarded thing. Not for a second this time, but sustained like he'd decided to let it. "Naomi," he said. "I know," she said. And she did. She knew what was in his face, and what it had cost a man like him to let her see it, and she knew what her own answer to it was, had known it for longer than she'd let herself articulate. "I'm not good at saying things," he said. "You're better than you think." "I'm not." He said it without self-pity. "Nathan used to say I talked like a man who charged by the word and was trying to keep costs down." She almost laughed. "That's accurate." "I know." He looked at her. "What I want to say is that He stopped. Started again. "What you did this winter, not just today. All of it. I want you to know that Another stop. His jaw worked. "That I see it. All of it. And I see you. And Silas. I'm trying to... I know what you're trying to say." She stepped back toward him. "You don't have to finish it perfectly. I understand the sentence." He looked at her for a long moment. "Do you?" "Yes," she said. "I've understood it for a while. I was waiting for you to catch up." Something broke open in his face. Not dramatically, not the way it happened in the stories she'd read as a girl, but quietly, in the specific way of a man who had been carrying a careful distance for a long time and had just set it down because the weight of it had finally exceeded the reason for it. He reached out and took her hand, which was the first deliberate touch between them that wasn't functional. Not the shoulder grab after the avalanche. Not the impersonal bootlacing in the stable. Not the accidental warmth of a shared bedroll in a 3-sided shelter. Just her hand in his, on a Billings boardwalk in May, in the plain evening air. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They went back to the mountain the following morning. The years that followed did not unfold smoothly, because nothing on a mountain in Montana unfolds smoothly, and because the 2 people living on that mountain were not people for whom smooth was ever the primary goal. There were hard winters, and one that was genuinely brutal, 1891, a winter that the Valley settlement still talked about years later. There was a season when the trapline produced almost nothing, and they ate through the preserved stores in a way that required careful rationing. There was a summer when a fire came close enough to the east meadow that they spent 3 days cutting firebreak and watching the sky. The estate transfer from Philadelphia completed in the fall of their first year, and they used it with the practical deliberateness of people who had learned that money was a tool, and tools were only as good as the purpose you put them to. The north roof was done properly. The water route from the northwest spring was engineered over 2 summers with Court's help. Court, who had grown from a lanky message carrier into a young man with a genuine aptitude for the kind of problem-solving the mountain required, and who spent increasing amounts of time at the Mercer property learning things Silas taught him and things Naomi taught him, which were different things and both useful. The kitchen garden went in the spring of their second year, in the East Meadows south-facing corner, where the sun reached longest. It was not immediately successful. She killed the first planting of onions through overwatering, which she didn't fully understand because she hadn't understood drainage at that altitude. The second planting did better. By the third year, the garden produced enough that they had genuine surplus in the fall, and she began tentatively at first, experimenting with Nathan's preservation methods. She expanded the herb stores. She worked through every entry in Nathan's notes over 3 years, testing and observing and writing down what she saw, building a knowledge that was partly his and partly hers, and partly something that emerged from the specific conditions of that specific place. Travelers who stopped at the cabin, and there were travelers because the Mercer property sat on the only reliable route between the South Valley and the high timber, which was the very thing Fletcher had wanted to exploit. Sometimes left with a preparation for something that was ailing them, and sometimes came back to report that it had helped. She was careful not to overstate what she knew. She told people what she'd observed, not what she was certain of. She kept writing things down. The first child was born in the winter of their 2nd year, a girl they named Clara, who arrived with the impartial indifference to convenient timing that children have always demonstrated, coming in the middle of a snowstorm at 4 in the morning with only Silas present, which was not ideal, but was what was available. Naomi delivered her own daughter by the light of the stove while giving Silas clear instructions that he followed with the focused compliance of a man who understood that this was not a situation where his opinions were relevant. Clara was healthy and loud and had, from approximately her 2nd week of life, a quality of directness in her gaze that Dolores Reardon, when they brought her down to the valley the following spring, observed meant she was going to give them considerable trouble. Dolores was not wrong. The second child was a boy, 2 years after Clara. They named him Nathan, which Silas proposed one evening at the table with the careful casualness of a man proposing something that mattered very much to him but didn't want to make a formal presentation of. Naomi said yes before he'd finished the sentence. Nathan, the child, was quieter than his sister from the start, more observant, with a habit of watching things carefully before he interacted with them that felt familiar to her in a way she couldn't immediately place, and then one afternoon placed clearly. He watched things the way his father watched things, with the patience of someone who believed that looking carefully was the prerequisite to doing anything well. Silas taught both children the trap line before they were 12. He taught them the weather signs, the marker system, the property boundaries. He taught them which ice was safe and which was not, and how to read the difference. And he taught them in the same way he'd taught Naomi, not by lecturing but by doing, and expecting them to watch and then try and then describe what they'd observed. Naomi taught them the herbs. She taught them Nathan's notes and her own additions to them. She taught Clara the measurement technique for survey documentation, which Clara found interesting, and she taught Nathan how to label things clearly and put them where you could find them again, which Nathan found natural because it matched how his mind already worked. She taught them both to read the faces of strangers for what moved underneath before the arrangement came down over it. She did not teach them that the world was fair, because it wasn't. She taught them that the world was navigable, which was different and more useful. Fletcher's consortium attempted one more approach to the property, 4 years after the hearing, through a different set of lawyers with a different technical argument about water rights on the Northwest Spring. The same spring Naomi had routed to the cabin, which had become, she understood now, a more significant asset than even she'd realized when she'd first read Nathan's notes about it. The new argument was more creative than the original one, and took Platt 3 months to dismantle, and the cost was significant. Fletcher himself appeared in Harwick Junction the winter of that year, which she heard about from court, and then saw herself when she made a supply run down in December. I was standing outside the general store in the cold, and he looked older than she remembered, and the clean coat was the same but wearing it differently. Not authority anymore, just fabric. He saw her across the street and he looked at her for a moment, and what crossed his face was not something she had a ready name for. Not defeat exactly. More like the expression of a man who has spent a lot of time and resources on a calculation that hasn't resolved the way the calculation said it should. She nodded at him because she was not interested in performing triumph and went into the general store. She heard, the following spring, that Fletcher's consortium had dissolved, the investors having redirected their interests to more cooperative opportunities elsewhere. She heard this from Court, who told her with unconcealed satisfaction, and she received it without the satisfaction he expected, because she had learned that the resolution of other people's bad intentions was less interesting than the continuation of her own life. There was a morning in their 6th year on the mountain, a clear June morning, the meadow flowers at their annual argument with each other about who was most visible, the sky doing the specific summer blue that she'd come to think of as the mountain's good mood, when she was standing at the south edge of the east meadow and she looked back at the cabin. Clara was chasing something through the long grass, a ground squirrel probably, or possibly just the idea of one. Nathan was sitting on the cabin step with a piece of wood and his father's smallest knife, doing something careful and slow that probably had a purpose she'd hear about later. Silas was coming out of the lean-to with Barnabas's lead rope, and the mule was behind him wearing the patient expression he'd worn since January of 1888, which was the expression of a creature that had seen considerable human drama and found it neither surprising nor particularly interesting. Silas looked up and saw her standing at the meadow's edge. He raised one hand. She raised her hand back. She thought about a train platform in January. She thought about a marriage broker who counted money while she stood 3 feet away. She thought about her uncle's voice at the kitchen table, sign it, or find somewhere else to sleep by Friday. She thought about the town's laughter and Fletcher's studied assessment, and Harlan Beach in her yard rearranging his face. She thought about what she'd been told all her life, about what she was and wasn't, what she deserved and didn't, what a woman who looked like her could reasonably expect from the world. The world had been wrong, not in a triumphant way, not in the way of stories where the wrongness is eventually punished, and the lesson is delivered neatly and everyone receives exactly what they earned. The world had been wrong in the ordinary, quiet way that the world is often wrong about people. It had looked at the surface of a thing and stopped looking, and the surface of a thing is never the whole of it. She had learned this about herself on a mountain, which was not where she'd have chosen to learn it, given a choice. But you don't choose where the learning happens. You only choose what you do with it after. What she had done was stay. Work. Write things down. Ask the next question. Make the next repair. Hold the rope when the rope needed holding. She had not become someone different from who she'd been in Philadelphia. That was the thing she'd needed the most time to understand. The mountain hadn't changed her into someone stronger or braver or more capable. It had put her in conditions where what she'd always been could finally be seen. By Silas, by Court, by Platt, and Crane, and eventually by herself. The frightened girl who'd stood on that train platform in January had been carrying all of this the whole time. She'd just never been in a place that gave her room to put it down and show what was underneath. She walked back across the meadow toward the cabin, through the June grass, past Nathan sitting on the step with his careful, slow work, past Clara who had given up on the ground squirrel and was now attempting to convince Barnabas to let her braid his forelock, which Barnabas was tolerating with the philosophical resignation of a mule who had outlasted considerable human ambition. Silas was at the lean-to door when she reached him. He handed her Barnabas's lead rope without comment because she'd taken over Barnabas's morning exercise 2 years ago and it had simply become her task, unremarked, the way most things that mattered had become unremarked between them. "Weather's holding," he said. "Good day to check the north stakes," she said. "The ones we still haven't replaced from the missing 2. He looked at her. "You've been thinking about that for 6 years. I think about things until they're done." She took the rope. "We'll go after lunch." He almost smiled. She could see it in the corner of his mouth. That thing that had been rare in January and was less rare now, worn down by years of her saying things he hadn't expected and meaning them. "Yes, ma'am," he said. The mountain rose behind them, unchanged. It did not care that they had won in court, or that the children were healthy, or that the herb stores were the most complete they'd been since Nathan's careful years. It did not register any of it. This was the thing she'd come to appreciate most in the end. Not the indifference itself. The indifference was hard, and it remained hard, but what the indifference clarified. When nothing around you cares about your history, or your family's opinion of you, or what a marriage broker said you were worth, you are left with only what you actually do. The mountain kept that account with perfect accuracy and cared nothing for any other. She had found, over 6 years of that accounting, that her balance was better than anyone had ever told her to expect. She led Barnabas out into the June morning, and Clara abandoned the braiding project and ran to join her. And behind her she could hear Nathan say something quiet to his father, and Silas say something back, and the mountain held them all in its vast, fair, completely indifferent hands. Which was, she had decided, enough. More than enough. More than the girl on that train platform in January had known how to ask for, which made it, in the particular arithmetic of a life that had started with very little, something close to everything.